Picture this. The entire human species, every upright, tool-toting, mildly confused ancestor, shrunk down to a crowd that could fit into a high school gymnasium. No roaring cities, no endless family trees, no online arguments about how to pronounce Neanderthal. Just a few thousand scrappy survivors clinging to existence. Imagine the entire human race crammed into one tiny village, with worse Wi-Fi and absolutely no coffee. If your palms are sweating at the thought of morning without caffeine, you're starting to grasp why scientists call this moment a bottleneck. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight we will explore the topic, how humanity almost vanished 900,000 years ago, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. In population genetics, a bottleneck is exactly what it sounds like. A moment when a once healthy population narrows to a frighteningly small number, just as sand pours slowly through the neck of an hourglass. Genetic diversity trickles through a narrow passage of survival. After the squeeze, every descendant carries roughly the same limited deck of genetic cards. Your DNA, it's basically a scrapbook of those few survivors' greatest hits. If the idea seems abstract, try this mental exercise. Put every family photo you own through a paper shredder until only a few snapshots survive. From those scraps, future generations must reconstruct your entire ancestry. That's humanity 900,000 years ago, an archive barely holding together. We don't have a fossil signpost saying "Welcome to the Endangered Species Club, year 900,000 BCE. Instead, we have genomes, the code printed inside every one of our cells. When scientists compare chunks of human DNA, they see suspicious uniformity, like cousins borrowing homework answers for a test no one studied for. Mathematical models say the best way to get that uniformity is to shrink the breeding population down to perhaps 1,000 individuals for a painfully long stretch of time. The math is sobering. Today there are over 8 billion of us complaining about slow elevators. Back then, you could have thrown a barbecue for the entire species and still had leftovers. Geneticists call this era the human bottleneck, or severe population constriction. It's like listening to whispers from a ghost civilization. Our DNA carries scars of missing diversity, variations that simply never reappeared because no one with those traits survived the squeeze. If you've ever wondered why humans are so genetically similar compared with, say, chimpanzees, thank or blame the bottleneck. Chimps didn't shrink down nearly as much, so they kept a wider wardrobe of genetic options. We're the hand-me-down species. Radiocarbon clocks tap out far earlier than 900,000 years. But scientists have other tricks. They cross-reference mutation rates, how often tiny copying errors creep into DNA, with patterns of variation across global populations. When the math lines up, it whispers, something dramatic happened here. Picture an archaeologist not dusting off pottery, but sifting through genetic footprints. The footprints stop abruptly, then resume as if only a few hardy trekkers kept walking. Realizing our species almost blinked out of existence reframes everything. That chatty genome you're carrying, it's the result of survivors who frankly didn't quit. They endured famine, storms, predators, and who knows how many nights wondering if the species was doomed. Every ancestor you have, from the cleverest fire builder to the one who probably tripped over rocks, represents an unbroken survival line through an evolutionary choke point narrower than the neck of your water bottle. And because the survivors were so few, they shaped the destiny of every person alive today. Think about it. Your freckles, your blood type, even your tendency to despise mornings may trace back to quirks possessed by those several thousand iron-willed ancestors. They didn't just pass down DNA, they passed down the audacity to stick around when Earth practically sent them an eviction notice. We still don't know exactly why humanity thinned so dramatically. Climate tantrums, resource collapse, overzealous saber-toothed cats treating us like takeout? That's for later chapters. For now, remember this. Long before the pyramids, Before cave paintings, before anyone coined the word civilization, our lineage came within a heartbeat of ending. So next time you're frustrated about slow coffee machines or internet outages, picture those ancestors staring down oblivion. They didn't survive for you to rage quit life because the Wi-Fi lagged. They toughed out a planetary game of musical chairs with almost no chairs left. And because they refused to disappear, you get to sit here grinning at history's closest call. Step outside your front door and imagine an Earth that looks like someone left the freezer door open for a few 100,000 years. That was our planet roughly 900,000 years ago, a place of mood swings so violent the weather report would have read, "Bundle up, then maybe build an ark." If you're worried about today's heat waves, back then the big fear was, global warming wasn't the worry, global please don't freeze my eyelashes was. Earth was locked into a rhythm of glacial and interglacial cycles, powered by tiny wobbles in the planet's orbit, the Milankovitch cycles for the trivia lovers. Imagine a cosmic DJ sliding the thermostat from mild picnic to deep freeze every few tens of thousands of years. Sheets of ice miles thick sprawled across much of Europe, North America, and Asia. Forests vanished under snow, sea levels dropped, and coastlines stretched far beyond today's maps. During glacial peaks, global temperatures could plummet 10-12 degrees below what we consider comfortable. Grasslands dried, rainfall staggered, and rivers shrank into sulky trickles. Interglacials teased slightly milder weather before slamming shut into another icy chapter. To our ancestors, this wasn't a Netflix binge of winter scenes. This was an endless season finale on repeat. The terrain our distant kin wandered looked almost alien. Much of Africa cycled between lush savannas and semi-arid scrub, yo-yoing with rainfall. Northern latitudes in Eurasia were frequently locked beneath glaciers while steppe tundra dominated what wasn't outright ice. Picture Siberia before the wool sweaters, a treeless expanse where the bravest blades of grass said, "We tried." In Europe, glaciers bulldozed mountains into new shapes and carved valleys deeper than an influencer's emotional vlog. Low sea levels revealed land bridges, Britain often attached to continental Europe, Asia welded to Indonesia, giving wandering herds and nomads convenient commuter lanes. If you've ever used a GPS shortcut through a cornfield, imagine that but with mammoths. A planet this dramatic naturally bred megafauna. Our ancestors shared real estate with mammoths, mastodons, and woolly rhinoceroses the size of today's delivery vans. There were short-faced bears towering over modern grizzlies and saber-toothed cats whose dental plan involved turning you into dinner. Not to be outdone, giant ground sloths lumbered around the Americas, swiping at tree branches like nature's slow-moving cranes. Even hoofed animals were supersized. Irish elk sported antlers wide enough to snag low-hanging branches like bad ceiling fans. If you ever wondered why our ancestors became experts at running, this was the reason your neighborhood looked like a Jurassic Park audition tape. One challenge was sheer instability. Areas once green could desiccate into dust bowls within centuries, a blink in evolutionary time. East Africa, a key hominin hub, flipped between inviting lake shores and cracked salt flats like an indecisive decorator. Lakes bloomed and vanished, herds migrated, and hominins had to decide daily whether to follow the food or stay and hope the rain remembered them. For creatures relying on stone tools and optimism, that's the definition of stress. The earth itself wasn't trying to kill them, but it often succeeded accidentally, starving herds, isolating groups, shoving clans into resource-poor pockets. One decade's fertile paradise could be next decade's congratulations, you've unlocked sand. Despite planetary chaos, early humans weren't homebodies. Fossil and artifact trails show Homo erectus and kin ranging across East and South Africa, the Levant corridor, parts of Central Asia, and even venturing into Europe when glaciers temporarily retreated. Coastal plains appeared whenever sea levels dropped, offering migration highways our ancestors happily or desperately strolled. Imagine trekking across a sunlit savanna one season, only to return a generation later and find it swallowed by scrubland, the local river now a rumor. That volatility forced hominins to remain nomadic opportunists. Today's passport stamps, they had footprints. Food dictated direction. Herds moved, humans followed, predators followed, humans, and the entire cycle spun like a survival merry-go-round. With every glacier advance, habitats shifted. Populations splintered into isolated bands, experimenting with whatever the terrain offered. Tubers, seeds, the occasional ill-fated rodent. Warm periods lured them into new territories only for ice walls to slam shut, stranding groups like forgotten campers. If ancient travel blogs existed, the reviews would read 5 stars for adventure, -5 stars for dying of exposure. This world echoed with crashing icebergs, roaring rivers swollen by meltwater, the thud of mammoth herds. Nights glimmered under clear, star-packed skies, bitter winds slicing through primitive firs. Fire, when reliably tamed, was as precious as life itself, though for many eras it flickered sporadically at best. Every campfire was both warmth and beacon. We're alive. Come at us, wolves. The key takeaway, the Earth our ancestors faced, was neither gentle nor static. It was a planet perpetually rehearsing for the next catastrophe, sculpting landscapes and testing every living thing's endurance. Into this unstable arena strode small, upright primates, whose best survival tools were curiosity, opposable thumbs, and an irritating refusal to give up. Their reality check: there were no safe zones, just shifting ice, unpredictable storms, and a to-do list reading, "Don't freeze, don't starve, don't get eaten." If you want to picture the celebrities of the Pleistocene, you have to lower your expectations. No capes, no castles, just wiry hominins trudging across savannas with stone tools, stubborn tenacity, and a hairstyle best described as permanent bad hair day. About 900,000 years ago, our stage was shared by Homo erectus and possibly early stirrings of Homo heidelbergensis, two species whose achievements can be summarized as "don't die yet" and "maybe invent something sharper than a stick." They are the nearly forgotten great-aunts and uncles of humanity, the ones who quietly kept our lineage in the game while the planet kept trying to cancel the show. Brains smaller than ours, yes, but they didn't waste them arguing on the internet, which may have given them a survival edge we can only dream of. Homo erectus had been around for a while by this point, veterans of survival in shifting climates. They averaged roughly 5 to 6 feet tall, sporting barrel-shaped rib cages and long limbs designed for endless walking. If you picture marathon runners with slightly sloping foreheads, you're in the neighborhood. Their cranial capacity hovered around 900 cubic centimeters, less than modern humans but enough for improvisation, coordination, and the occasional "don't poke the giant cat" revelation. They weren't philosophers, but they were persistent, and persistence is an underrated superpower when saber-toothed cats are deciding who's on the menu. Fossil evidence paints a picture of individuals who were lean, muscular, and tirelessly mobile. These weren't couch dwellers. They were the original long-distance hikers, striding across continents with nothing but stone flakes, a cooperative social structure, and optimism. Teeth were large and sturdy, suited for chewing fibrous roots, tough meat, and whatever else the environment begrudgingly offered. Their jaws were powerful because dinner wasn't always tender. Sometimes it resembled chewing an old leather boot and calling it fine dining. Homo heidelbergensis, emerging somewhere around this era, looked more robust, broader shoulders, heavier build, cranial capacity, nudging toward 1,200 cubic centimeters. Some researchers see them as a bridge between Homo erectus and both Neanderthals and us, the species quietly test-driving features we'd later claim as our own. Think of them as beta versions of modern humans, slightly experimental, perhaps more resilient in harsh cold, with skeletons hinting at significant physical strength. If Homo erectus was the ultramarathoner, Homo heidelbergensis was the powerlifter who could also hike mountains. Life demanded relentless adaptability. Nomadic groups roamed open grasslands, woodlands, and patchwork scrub, chasing herds of ungulates, scavenging carcasses, cracking bones for marrow, and prying tubers from stubborn soil. Every sunrise was a fresh riddle. Which way is the food? Where's the water? How many of us will make it past sunset? Shelter meant caves, overhangs, or makeshift windbreaks cobbled together from branches and hides. Forget mortgages. Real estate was wherever you could duck inside before the rain turned hypothermia into a lifestyle. Social structures were likely tight-knit and cooperative. Survival wasn't a solo sport. Sharing information, pooling resources, and coordinating hunts improved the odds. Even rudimentary vocalizations, gestures, and facial cues helped. Language wasn't Shakespeare yet, but a grunt meaning lion delivered at the right moment was Nobel-worthy. Fire, though not fully mastered everywhere, may have been tamed sporadically by Homo erectus, turning darkness into safety and raw meat into something slightly less chewy. Around a fire, plans could be hashed out, relationships reinforced, and predators discouraged. Nature's version of putting a no-vacancy sign on your campsite. Their tools, though simple by modern standards, represented a technological leap. Hand axes, bifacially chipped, served as the Swiss Army knives of the Pleistocene, good for chopping wood, butchering carcasses, and possibly swatting away the over-enthusiastic hyena. A chipped stone wasn't glamorous, but in a world of tooth and claw, it meant leverage. Innovation crept forward with maddening slowness, but even incremental improvement mattered. A sharper edge could mean fewer hours scraping a hide, more calories preserved, and more time not freezing to death. Hunting strategies balanced opportunism and nerve. Direct confrontation with megafauna was risky, so scavenging and persistence hunting filled much of the menu. Persistence hunting was the art of following prey over miles, until it overheated and gave up, a sport demanding patience, endurance, and questionable sanity. When successful, the payoff was protein-rich meat, a treasure trove for calorie-hungry brains already testing the limits of expansion. That protein-fueled feedback loop, more meat, more energy for the brain, better problem-solving, was slow but transformative. Daily existence was an exercise in hyper-awareness. Each rustle of grass could mean dinner or death. Each cloud shift threatened drought or storm. Young ones learned by watching, mimicking, and occasionally surviving mistakes. Old age was rare and revered, scars serving as badges of resilience. Play, bonding, and rudimentary teaching forged communal memory. Lessons etched not on parchment but in practice, repeated across generations. Against the backdrop of shifting glaciers and predatory neighbors, these hominins carried on, step by stubborn step. They didn't leave behind poetry or politics, but they left footprints across continents, proof that grit can substitute for genius when the environment is merciless. Their greatest achievement wasn't invention, it was endurance, the refusal to vanish when the odds begged them to. Without their plodding perseverance, there would be no later leaps of culture, no paintings on cave walls, no debates over the virtues of pineapple on pizza. Their world was brutal, yet they made it home, sometimes huddled in rock shelters, sometimes chasing antelope under a pitiless sun, always improvising with whatever they could chip, carry, or remember. The unbroken thread from them to us is a testament not to brilliance, but to sheer survival instinct sharpened over countless migrations and hardships. They weren't almost human curiosities. They were the ones who refused to blink when the planet dared them to. If the past had left us a diary, we'd have answers in crisp handwriting. Dear future descendants, today was chilly, ate some roots, almost eaten by a lion, love you. Unfortunately, history wasn't that sentimental, and parchment was still a million years away. Instead, the story of our near demise is scribbled invisibly in the spiral staircase of DNA that coils inside every cell. Like forensic accountants hunting for missing money, scientists pore over genomes hunting for missing ancestors. And the verdict is hauntingly clear. Our family tree once looked more like a bonsai. Genealogists hate this one weird trick, having almost nobody left to track. The first thing to grasp is that your DNA is more than a personal blueprint. It's a time capsule. Every stretch of code, every typo, scientists call them mutations, but typo makes them sound friendlier, records who we are and how long we've been changing. Think of mutations as cosmic post-it notes. Over generations they accumulate at roughly predictable rates, which means if you know how many notes you've got, you can roughly tell how long the notebook has been circulating. Compare notebooks across the population and you start spotting glaring gaps. Pages where variation should exist but doesn't. That's where the notion of an effective breeding population creeps in. It's not the census of everyone alive at the time, but the head count of individuals who actually pass their genes forward. Imagine a high school dance with 100 kids but only 10 couples actually dance. The rest hover awkwardly near the punch bowl. Your effective dancers are 20, not 100. Similarly, a species may have a few thousand individuals roaming about, but if famine, disease, or geography prevents them from reproducing, the gene pool behaves as though only a few dozen matter. From the DNA's perspective, everyone else was essentially background noise. Researchers decode this by sampling modern human genomes from every continent, then feeding the patterns into computational models. These models reverse engineer how much variation you'd expect if a population had always been big, versus what you actually see. Picture a crowd photo that looks suspiciously thin, even though the party supposedly had thousands of guests. That mismatch screams bottleneck. Our genome carries such a mismatch, screaming at roughly the 900,000 year mark. Something squeezed our numbers down to perhaps 1,000, 10,000 breeding individuals, a sliver of the multitudes we imagine. The detective work doesn't stop there. Scientists analyze linkage disequilibrium, how often genes travel together rather than shuffle independently. In healthy, sprawling populations, genes shuffle like poker decks, scattering across generations. After a bottleneck, too few decks remain, and odd combinations stick together longer, like stubborn cliques at a reunion. It's as if every branch of the family keeps using the same recipe card because no other options exist. Another whisper from the past hides in mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, the little power plant genome you inherit from your mother. Because mtDNA doesn't reshuffle each generation the way nuclear DNA does. It preserves a clearer signal of how populations expand or contract. Analyses of mtDNA variation repeatedly circle back to the same unsettling story. An extended period when our ancestors' diversity flatlined, like a heart monitor stuck on barely alive. Even the Y chromosome, stubbornly trudging down the paternal line, agrees. It shows reduced variability during the same epoch, implying Dad's side of the tree was also down to a few lonely branches. It's almost poetic, two different genetic narrators humming the same melancholy tune from opposite sides of the family. Population modelers take these clues and simulate countless what-if scenarios. If humanity had maintained millions of breeding adults, genetic drift would produce a much richer mosaic of differences by now. We'd see rarer haplogroups, deeper splits, longer branches in our phylogenetic tree. Instead, the branches look trimmed, the trunk narrow. The only realistic way to produce such uniformity is to have nearly everyone blink out, leaving a few persistent lineages to repopulate. And yet, the genome isn't just doom and gloom, it's testimony. From that narrow base, subsequent millennia saw slow but steady accumulation of new variation, like a meadow regrowing after wildfire. Every slight difference between you and the person next to you, eye color, lactose tolerance, weird cilantro hatred, sprouted from the few survivors' genetic seeds. Your chromosomes are crowded with signatures of past hardship, sequences preserved not by comfort, but by sheer obstinacy. It's also why humans are surprisingly homogeneous compared with other primates. Two chimpanzees from opposite sides of a forest can differ genetically more than any two humans from opposite ends of the planet. When you realize our ancestors' head count once rivaled a small-town book club, the homogeneity stops being mysterious and becomes downright impressive. Our diversity is a patchwork stitched since the bottleneck, a quilt sewn from minimal scraps. This insight reshapes our sense of identity. The vast, bustling 8 billion-strong humanity you see today descends from a handful of individuals who managed not to freeze, starve, or serve as saber-tooth appetizers. In genetic terms, every human alive is a close cousin, branches sprouting from a narrow trunk, Your stranger on the subway, practically extended family, though maybe don't invite them to Thanksgiving just yet. Science can't hand us names or faces, only probability curves and silent markers. But that's enough to reveal an astonishing truth. Our lineage skated perilously close to oblivion and left behind breadcrumbs in code. Each cell you carry hums the refrain, "We almost didn't make it." Understanding that hum doesn't just satisfy curiosity. It reminds us survival isn't inevitable. It's earned, sometimes by sheer stubborn luck, sometimes by quiet resilience. When you picture a culprit behind humanity's brush with extinction, you might imagine saber-toothed cats sharpening their oversized cutlery, or rival hominins plotting territorial takeovers. But some of the most lethal villains never roared or stalked. They gusted, froze, flooded, and withered. Long before meteorologists handed us color-coded storm warnings, the planet was the ultimate drama queen, flinging glaciers like confetti and drying lakes faster than you can say "where's lunch?" Breakfast wasn't cancelled, breakfast simply didn't exist. Roughly 900,000 years ago, Earth's thermostat was in full identity crisis. Milankovitch cycles, the slow wobble, tilt and stretch of our planet's orbit, kept nudging sunlight distribution like a cosmic dimmer switch. The result? Glacial periods so severe that ice sheets sprawled across continents, hoarding fresh water like a miser hoards coins. Global temperatures plunged, winds stiffened, and oceans obediently retreated, exposing seafloors but leaving inland habitats thirsty. One year, you're foraging near a lush lake. A geological blink later, you're standing on cracked mud staring at dust devils. For hominins barely armed with chipped stones and optimism, this climatic ping-pong was devastating. Glaciers creeping down from polar realms erased forests and grasslands, bulldozing everything into white oblivion. Rivers rerouted, fertile valleys drowned beneath ice, and plant communities scrambled to survive anywhere warmth lingered. Each cold snap translated to fewer berries, fewer roots, fewer grazers for the hunter-scavenger menu. Meanwhile, interglacials teased a reprieve, milder seasons, regrowth, the illusion that stability had finally RSVP'd before slamming the freezer door again. Droughts played the cruel supporting role. Shifting monsoons and collapsing rainfall patterns starved the African Rift Valley of dependable water. Lakes shrank into puddles, forcing herbivores to abandon once reliable pastures. Picture wildebeest scanning a horizon that keeps moving the dinner table farther away. Every mile those herds wandered dragged our ancestors along on a treadmill of scarcity. Staying behind meant starvation, following meant risk. New predators, strange terrain, and the ever-looming possibility of arriving too late to the watering hole. Habitat shrinkage was relentless. Savannas contracted into scrubland, woodlands withered into barren expanses. Early hominins found themselves living in ecological cul-de-sacs, isolated pockets where resources vanished faster than they could adapt. Genetic diversity faltered not because our ancestors suddenly lost their dating game, but because surviving long enough to reproduce became a cosmic lottery. You couldn't plan family life when rainfall schedules behaved like prank calls. Climate chaos also warped migration. Land bridges emerged as sea levels fell, beckoning bold explorers toward distant plains. Yet advancing glaciers could sever return routes, stranding groups in marginal habitats. Imagine hiking to a promising valley only to discover winter has permanently locked the exit. Isolation invites inbreeding, genetic drift, and vulnerability. The tiniest misstep, a bad harvest, a predator ambush, could erase an entire band. In a booming population, setbacks are bumps. In a bottleneck, they're cliffs. Food scarcity amplified every risk. Grazing herds thinned or vanished. Predators, equally hungry, prowled with desperate boldness. The hunting-scavenging calculus shifted. Fewer carcasses to claim. Fiercer competition when one appeared. Foraging for tubers or seeds turned into marathon searches across barren ground, and caloric returns often lagged behind the energy spent walking. Hunger isn't just uncomfortable, it blunts decision-making, weakens bodies, and reduces the chances of surviving injury or illness. Malnourished adults have fewer offspring. Malnourished offspring rarely reach adulthood. The arithmetic was merciless. Cold also rewrote the survival rulebook. Bitter nights drained body heat, demanding shelter or fire mastery many groups lacked. Wind chill gnawed at exposed skin. Frostbitten extremities slowed foraging trips, and game animals shifted ranges or huddled in inaccessible valleys. Even brief thaws followed by deep freezes spelled catastrophe, slush transforming into treacherous ice, trapping unwary animals and unwary bipeds alike. Every expedition required risk-reward calculations. Modern office workers only simulate when deciding whether to leave the couch for snacks. Unlike predators or rival tribes, you can't negotiate with climate. You can't outroar a glacier, can't scare off a drought, can't bribe the monsoon. Entire generations learned hard lessons in humility, adapt or vanish. Those with even rudimentary cooperative habits, sharing information on waterholes, dividing limited spoils, watching weather cues gained slim but vital edges. Evolution quietly rewarded bodies capable of endurance, minds capable of foresight, and groups capable of flexibility. Yet even with those traits, survival was never guaranteed. Sheer luck often separated future ancestors from forgotten fossils. The evidence of this turmoil still sleeps in geological archives. Sediment cores from ancient lakes reveal abrupt swings between wet and dry phases. Pollen grains chart vanishing forests. Resurrected grasslands, then vanished again. Oxygen isotopes in deep-sea shells narrate temperature dives and rebounds like an erratic heartbeat. Cross-referencing these clues with DNA timelines, researchers see how environmental upheaval cornered our lineage repeatedly until only a sliver endured. Climate chaos didn't simply threaten individuals, it rewrote ecosystems, turning bustling food webs into skeletal frameworks. With every lost watering hole or frozen meadow, early humans faced the same existential question: move, starve, or gamble. Over millennia, repeated rollbacks shaved population after population until the survivors could, theoretically, gather around a single campfire without overcrowding. That campfire's smoke might have been faint, but it carried the stubborn message that life, against planetary tantrums, still refused to quit. The great irony is that this very instability forged resilience. Those who stumbled onward, adapting to brutal winters, improvising diets, and stretching cooperation beyond family ties, seeded the recovery when climates finally steadied. Catastrophe pruned the tree, but didn't rip out the roots. From those chilled, hungry remnants, humanity began slowly, uncertainly to rebound. The ice may have ruled the headlines, but the footnote reads, "They endured anyway." If you think modern life is stressful, try grocery shopping in a landscape where the grocery list reads, "One gazelle, hopefully not you," and the produce aisle snarls back. Long before supermarkets and home delivery, our ancestors' world was patrolled by jaws, claws, and an unforgiving food chain. Back then, the phrase fast food meant you ran or you were it. Step onto an African savanna or Eurasian steppe 900,000 years ago, and you're entering a Pleistocene theme park with no exit signs. Saber-toothed cats lounged in the shade, each canine roughly the length of a steak knife, glinting like nature's overzealous cutlery. These weren't cartoon felines posing for selfies. They were ambush professionals, low-slung missiles of muscle capable of sprinting, grappling, and delivering puncture wounds no amount of herbal poultice could fix. A band of hominins stumbling across their path wasn't competition, it was delivery service. And the saber-tooths had friends. Giant hyenas prowled the grasslands, bulkier and more powerful than their modern cousins, crushing bones with jaws that could turn femurs into confetti. Even after a successful hunt, early humans faced the grim sequel, keeping it. Picture a weary group gnawing on roasted antelope only to hear the guttural chuckle of a hyena orchestra rolling closer. One stolen carcass meant wasted calories, empty bellies, and another dangerous foraging trip. Bears too played their part. Eurasian cave bears, some twice the mass of a modern grizzly, claimed prime shelters long before humans dreamed of hanging a home sweet home sign. Stumbling into an occupied cave could end faster than you could mutter, "Maybe they'll share." Competition for den sites meant that even resting carried mortal risk. Meanwhile, packs of dire wolves, stockier, stronger relatives of today's grey wolves, trailed herds and by extension hominins shadowing those herds. Outrun the antelope, yes, but could you also outwit a dozen hungry canids practicing teamwork centuries before corporate retreats? Predators weren't the only ones tightening the vice. Other hominin species loomed as rivals for meat, water and territory. Homo erectus bands, already seasoned by centuries of adaptation, bumped shoulders and occasionally skulls with early Homo heidelbergensis or whatever experimental branch of our family tree happened to be squatting on the next patch of shade. Unlike predators, rivals wanted the same limited scraps, roots, carcasses, maybe even the same meager shelter. Cooperation sometimes emerged, but conflict was never off the table. One disputed carcass could spiral into rock-flinging chaos faster than you can say shared custody of this gazelle. Scarcity magnified every encounter. Imagine trailing a herd for days, stalking, strategizing, finally toppling a calf and a rival group materializes, hefting stones, flashing intimidating glares. Fight and you risk injury, that infection turns lethal. Flee and you surrender the week's only real meal. A bad decision didn't just sting pride, it trimmed survival odds for your entire clan. For creatures hovering at the edge of a population collapse, each lost meal was an invitation for natural selection to tighten the noose. Predator-prey dynamics shaped behavior. Early hominins learned to scan horizons obsessively, tune ears to the faintest rustle, and treat twilight strolls like signing up for voluntary danger. Group vigilance became as crucial as spear points. An extra set of eyes might mean detecting a lion's twitching tail before the ambush closed. Tool use, crude as it was, doubled as both hunting kit and insurance policy. Sharp flakes to deflect a charging cat. Smoldering sticks waved like primitive security systems. Survival wasn't just strength, it was choreography. Knowing when to stand ground, when to scatter, and when to bluff bigger than you felt. Even plant foraging carried risk. Stooping to dig tubers might leave you so focused on root vegetables that you missed the leopard eyeing you from a branch. Night offered no peace. Predators excelled in darkness while humans merely endured it. Fire, when mastered, brought a modest zone of safety, yet sparks died quickly, and carrying embers from site to site was as finicky as babysitting a dragon egg. Competition extended to scavenging rights. Rotting carcasses attracted a menagerie of contenders. Vultures circling overhead, jackals snapping at flanks, crocodiles lurking by water's edge. To claim even a rib, humans timed approaches like gamblers counting cards, rushing in when toothier mouths were distracted. Retreating the moment dominance displays escalated. Calories obtained this way were precarious, but often life-saving. If you survived the gauntlet of claws and beaks, genetic survival under such conditions demanded more than brawn. Social cohesion, cooperative defense, food sharing, coordinated watch rotations shifted from luxury to necessity. Individuals who panicked alone tended to decorate food chains. Those who stuck with a group multiplied watchfulness and muscle. Predator pressure nudged our lineage toward ever tighter communication, rudimentary signals, and trust webs that later blossomed into full-fledged societies. Ironically, the beasts that stalked our ancestors may have shepherded the very instincts, cooperation, planning, empathy that underpin civilization. In the grim arithmetic of the Pleistocene, every predator encounter tallied risk. A slip near a riverbank, a sprained ankle, an unguarded moment at dusk, each could mark the end of a bloodline. That we persisted owes less to invincibility and more to a stubborn cocktail of caution, ingenuity, and sheer nerve. Humanity's rebound wasn't inevitable, it was eked from the margins, bone by bone, meal by stolen meal, under the ever-watchful gaze of teeth gleaming in the grass. Imagine being handed the survival starter pack for Earth circa 900,000 years ago. 2 hands, a brain still beta-testing problem-solving, and a vague urge not to die. No metal, no agriculture, no cozy fleece jacket, just optimism wrapped in bare skin. Inventing fire was great. Remembering how to keep it lit in the rain, less great. The archaeological breadcrumbs of this era show stone tools scattered like the aftermath of an overzealous toddler with a rock collection. These implements, part of what scholars lump under the Acheulean tradition, were the Pleistocene equivalent of multi-tools, hand axes chipped on both sides, hefty cleavers, and sharp flakes that doubled as knives. Not sleek, ergonomic, or OSHA-approved, but crucial for butchering meat, slicing plant fibers, and cracking stubborn marrow bones. Crafting one required patience. Napping flint or quartzite into usable shapes meant striking just so, nudging off thin flakes without shattering the whole core. Each successful hand axe was part weapon, part status symbol, part survival guarantee. Yet stone alone was no magic bullet. Cutting hides or dismembering carcasses is useful, but doesn't solve winter's bite, water scarcity, or the saber-toothed cat evaluating your lunch menu. Early hominins had no bows, no pottery, no cozy huts. Their toolkit was barely a whisper compared to what Homo sapiens would later wield. That technological gap kept survival perpetually precarious. Every task, from cracking nuts to scaring predators, demanded ingenuity the tools barely supplied. Fire was the holy grail, but mastery remained hit or miss. Evidence suggests controlled fire popped up intermittently. Charred bones, reddened hearthstones, ash layers hint at meals or warmth. Yet controlled often meant opportunistic, snatching embers from a natural blaze, coaxing coals like a nervous intern handling plutonium. Striking sparks at will, a trick we take for granted with a cheap lighter, may have eluded many groups. Keeping flames alive through storms or migrations required vigilance. Rain could erase comfort in minutes, plunging the clan back into darkness and shivering regret. Without reliable fire, nights stretched dangerous, predators prowled, while humans huddled, relying on group proximity and sheer luck. Daytime warmth gave way to evening chill, lowering core temperatures, sapping energy, and encouraging illnesses modern medicine could fix in a pharmacy run, but which then spelled doom. A burning branch offered deterrence against prowling jaws, yet a sputtering ember was hardly a fortress. Imagine bedtime routines consisting of "did you feed the fire?" instead of "did you lock the door?" The technological ceiling limited diets. Sharp stones helped carve scavenged carcasses, but lacked the finesse to store surplus or cook starchy tubers into digestible feasts. Raw roots taxed digestion, raw meat risked parasites. Cooking, when reliably managed, unlocked calories otherwise trapped in tough fibers, but until fire became routine, meals were unpredictable. A hand axe can skin a gazelle, it cannot conjure gazelles from a barren plain. Survival often meant sprinting toward opportunity, not planning beyond the next hunger pang. Still, the toolkit nudged behavior forward. Stones shaped to a purpose reflect foresight, selecting raw materials, anticipating need, even teaching technique to offspring. These sparks of planning hint at minds rehearsing tomorrow's problems, not merely reacting to today's. Carcass processing improved nutrient extraction, marrow for fat, brains for rich calories, tiny advantages magnified over generations, teetering at the edge of demographic collapse. Social dynamics also tethered to technology. Tool-making was a team sport of sorts, observing, imitating, refining. The knowledge chain depended on storytelling long before words existed. Gestures, demonstrations, grunts of approval when a novice finally chipped the right angle. Each refined edge transmitted survival wisdom, knitting small groups tighter, sharing embers, or protecting a communal hearth reinforced cooperation, a trait far more valuable than a perfect blade. The fragility of this progress can't be overstated. Lose your cutting core in a river crossing, and you're back to improvising with jagged stones. Drift embers into damp ash, and the night suddenly feels two predators closer, unlike modern tools with backups at the hardware store. Early implements carried existential stakes. A broken hand axe wasn't just inconvenient, it could cost a carcass, a pelt, or a life. Ironically, these technological constraints shaped resilience. When you've weathered storms with nothing but grit, stone, and occasional fire, adaptability becomes instinct. Every meal, every hearth, every dull flake honed behavioral flexibility. Missteps culled the unlucky. Successes accumulated in genes and culture. The survivors of this Stone Age minimalism carried forward minds increasingly wired for innovation. It's tempting to view this era as bleak, yet the endurance it demanded seeded our eventual triumph. That flicker of fire under a dripping overhang, the rough-edged hand axe smoothed by endless grips, the shared grunt of satisfaction after cracking a marrow bone. These were the tiny victories that kept the lineage breathing. Tools didn't conquer the world overnight. They scratched footholds into its cliffs. Humanity's toolkit 900 millennia ago was neither glamorous nor foolproof, but in a landscape ruled by claws and cold, even a chipped rock was rebellion, a refusal to accept bare-handed helplessness. Each spark sheltered against the dark. Each stone edge whispered, "We will try again tomorrow." Picture waking every dawn to the same exhausted faces, because those are, quite literally, all the faces. Forget bustling cities or even quaint hamlets. Community around 900,000 years ago may have meant a scattering of families huddled near a waterhole, swapping embers and hoping predators had already eaten elsewhere. Dating apps were basically, "Hi, you're breathing, I'm breathing. Let's make sure humanity exists next week." A population bottleneck shrinks the social world to its barest outline. If only a few hundred or a few thousand individuals carry the future on their shoulders. Gossip travels faster than a brush fire. Everyone knows who borrowed whose hand axe, which cousin tripped over a root, and who hasn't pulled their weight gathering roots. Privacy isn't a luxury, it's an alien concept. Survival depends on trust built by shared hardship. One unreliable bandmate doesn't just annoy, it endangers the entire clan. The daily rhythm blended monotony and tension. Mornings began with patrols, scanning the horizon for tracks, sniffing for decay that might mean carrion, listening for the rattle of wind through thorn trees. A subtle weather report. Children, precious commodities in a species flirting with extinction, rarely strayed out of arm's reach. Adults split tasks with pragmatic choreography. A few to forage tubers, others to follow migrating herds. Another pair tending that fickle fire. Division of labor wasn't an economic theory. It was an instinct forged by cold nights and empty stomachs. Food sharing cemented bonds. A successful scavenger didn't hoard. Hoarding sowed resentment, and resentment fractured unity. Meat was portioned with careful fairness, not out of altruism alone, but because starving neighbors tomorrow meant weaker allies when a hyena pack prowled. Social contracts here were unwritten but ironclad. You contribute what you can. The group keeps you alive. Fail the contract repeatedly and, well, saber-tooth seldom ask for background checks. Mating challenges were less romance, more logistics. With so few partners, exogamy, seeking mates outside your immediate kin, was crucial to avoid genetic stagnation. Bands sometimes converged seasonally, mingling embers, exchanging stories, and, with pragmatic optimism, exchanging partners. Courtship rituals, probably closer to glances, offerings of roasted marrow, and demonstrated competency at not dying. Love language was a steady hand when hauling water or a quick shove away from a falling branch. Poetry could wait a few 100,000 years. Child-rearing consumed energy disproportionate to tiny population size. Every birth was a statistical victory, every infant a fragile vessel of the lineage's hopes. Mothers relied on parenting, siblings, aunts, even grey-haired elders lending arms, carrying loads, soothing wails. Children who survived teething, infections, and clumsy curiosity were investments in tomorrow's foraging crew. Mortality was high, but nurturing instincts grew sharper with each loss, sculpting cooperative childcare that later civilizations would formalize into villages raised children. Luck was the silent partner in every plan. A stray infection, a broken ankle, or a surprise storm could erase half a camp's caloric buffer. Illness carried no prescriptions. Herbal intuition and rest offered slim comfort against fevers. Fortune favored those with resilience and timing. arriving at a berry patch just before birds stripped it, reaching a waterhole moments before it silted dry. Stories around the fire undoubtedly framed survival as half skill, half the caprice of unseen spirits, or, as we'd phrase it now, random chance. Cultural sparks flickered in this crucible. Gesture-based communication thickened into proto-languages, grunts, clicks, and rhythmic taps that mapped landscapes, shared danger alerts, and maybe even chuckled at mishaps. Repetition of useful patterns, routes, shelters, resource caches, seeded traditions. Tiny rituals marking an elder's death with pebbles, celebrating a child's first steps, stitched meaning into precarious lives. Memory became currency. Elders as living libraries, narrating which valley hides water, which root sates hunger but poisons if eaten raw. Tool repair, fire tending, and nightly vigilance became communal art forms. Someone inevitably specialized, one person with a knack for flint, another with keen ears for rustling grass, a third adept at calming infants. There was no formal leadership, but competence earned deference. A confident decision at a critical moment, move upriver now, rains smell wrong, saved skins and won respect. Hierarchies were pragmatic, fleeting and responsive to results, not ego. Emotionally, Bottleneck life was a strange mix of intimacy and claustrophobia. Familiarity bred trust, but also the occasional, "I've heard your hunting story 1,000 times" eye roll. Bonds forged under existential threat, however, ran deep. Grudges simmered less when tomorrow's safety demanded solidarity. Humor likely surfaced as tension's pressure valve, mocking clumsy spear throws, mimicking predator calls to break monotony. Laughter wasn't luxury, it was resilience disguised as silliness. The thinness of numbers amplified risk but also streamlined identity. Us wasn't an abstract construct. It was everyone you could name, count, and slap awake for fire duty. Kinship blurred into necessity. Cousin, friend, rival, they were all pieces of the same lifeboat on a stormy sea. Modern concepts like privacy or independence would have baffled them. Survival was inherently communal. From such slender threads, humanity's future dangled. The Bottleneck village wasn't glamorous. Mud, smoke, aching muscles, constant low-grade dread, but it nurtured cooperation, flexibility, and a relentless will to persist. That will, tested against cold nights and prowling jaws, forged habits of empathy and shared purpose destined to echo through millennia. Each hearth, each whispered story, each awkward courtship was a silent rebellion against oblivion. We're still here, and we intend to stay. Survival of the fittest, although at that point fittest mostly meant not eaten yet. After millennia of scraping by with fewer neighbors than a remote mountain hamlet, our battered lineage began the slow, quiet miracle of recovery. No fanfare, no trumpets, just small clusters of determined bipeds, nudging numbers upward, while ice retreated, rains returned, and luck stopped spitting in their faces quite so often. Picture a few scattered families in an African valley. Embers flickering, children wobbling upright, elders recounting where streams swell after rain. Every surviving birth felt like interest earned on a fragile bank account. As mortality dipped just a hair, population graphs wobbled upward. Infants still faced a brutal gauntlet, but slightly steadier food access and a smidgen fewer saber-toothed interruptions tipped the odds. Growth was glacially slow, yet over tens of thousands of seasons, glacially slow turns monumental. Migration followed food like iron filings follow a magnet, with ice sheets loosening their chokehold, grasslands stitched back together, rivers meandered reliably again, and game herds remembered old trails. Hominin groups, descendants of that Bottleneck village, began walking, south into savannas, north toward temperate forests, sometimes simply sideways into "let's see what's over that ridge." Each step carried DNA from ancestors who had survived droughts, predators, and sheer cosmic bad luck. These wanderers weren't conquering, they were repopulating, filling ecological niches one cautious campsite at a time. Genetics played the stealth hero. Even after the crash, the survivors retained enough variability to fuel adaptation. Traits that once merely helped, keen eyes, nimble fingers, Patience for long foraging trips became lifelines when tested against shifting landscapes. Brain volume, already trending upward, offered subtler problem-solving. A sharper memory meant recalling berry patches ripening after floods. Foresight turned improvisation into rudimentary strategy. Intelligence in this crucible was less about philosophy and more about where's tomorrow's water. Cooperation deepened. Generations of depending on one another underlined an unspoken truth. Lone wolves starve, bonded groups endure. Sharing food, protecting fire, and defending young remained sacred practices. But now those practices scaled. Intergroup encounters, once fraught with tension, sometimes turned into alliances, joint hunts, exchange of mates, pooling of tool-making wisdom. Diversity within small bands bred resilience. Diversity between bands meant richer gene flow and broader survival know-how. Tool refinement accelerated incrementally. Acheulean hand axes gained subtler edges. Flake production improved. Controlled fire, once a sometimes magic, edged closer to routine. Cooking softened tubers, neutralized some pathogens, and liberated calories hidden inside stubborn fibers. That caloric surplus, modest but real, underwrote brain expansion, reproductive success, and a margin of safety when hunting flopped. Hearths expanded the day, warded off prowlers, and created social space for storytelling, planning, and proto-gossip. Did you see Caro trip over the log? Classic. Cultural memory stitched generations. Lessons hardened into traditions. This valley floods. That ridge shelters wind. That plant cures bellyaches if you don't overdo it. Stories first in gestures, later in vocal patterns, encoded maps, seasons, and taboos. Losing elders now meant losing libraries, so reverence for age became survival logic. Language, even embryonic, turned guesswork into shared foresight, making hunts coordinated, migrations deliberate, and child-rearing communal. Luck remained fickle. Earth still flung droughts and predators. Lightning still roasted careless trees. Yet each setback now fell on slightly sturdier shoulders. Populations thickened enough that disaster in one valley didn't extinguish the species. Neighboring bands could adopt or merge survivors, transplanting culture alongside genes. Variety blossomed. Some groups favored river valleys, others trailed antelope migrations, others braved cooler forests. Adaptive radiation, that Darwinian branching, began sowing subtle distinctions in gait, endurance, and diet tolerance. The psychological toll of near extinction lingered. Vigilance was baked into habit, checking the sky for storm scent, scanning grass for twitching tails, guarding embers as though life itself resided in their glow. Yet that constant caution paired with curiosity, an instinct to seek safer niches, richer grounds, anything that promised tomorrow. Without written history, trauma lived in behavior. Cautionary tales enacted as ritual. Newborns shielded with almost superstitious care. Pathways memorized as though forgetting meant erasure. Millennia blurred. Bottleneck remnants expanded like a puddle after rain, first locally, then across continents. Small successes compounded. A healthy harvest of tubers one year, a bountiful herd another. Children outnumbered funerals, and lineages no longer teetered on a cliff edge. Where once humanity could have squeezed around a campfire, now scattered fires dotted ridges, plains, and river mouths. The species no longer whispered on survival's edge. It murmured, then chattered, then roared. Crucially, this rebound wasn't destiny, it was endurance meeting opportunity. Nature stopped throwing quite so many bricks, and the survivors capitalized. Tiny advantages, better tool grip, calmer temperament, under stress, willingness to share marrow, scaled into demographic momentum. Cooperation turned from emergency measure into cultural backbone. From there, diversification was inevitable. Each branching group carried the same stubborn genome forged in adversity, tweaking it to local challenges like chefs experimenting with the same base dough. By the time later hominins emerged recognizable to us, the cliffhanger was over. Humanity had stepped back from oblivion, traded despair for adaptation, and begun rehearsing its next acts: artistry, migration beyond Africa, and eventually civilizations that would fret about taxes and traffic instead of hyenas. From a near-empty stage, the play resumed, starring descendants of those unremarkable but indefatigable survivors. We've dodged oblivion once, let's not schedule a sequel. Humanity's near demise 900,000 years ago isn't just a curiosity for geneticists, it's a flashing neon sign reminding us how precarious survival can be, even for a species that thinks building cities on floodplains is a great idea. The ghosts of that bottleneck live quietly inside us, humming through our chromosomes, hinting at the razor-thin line between global dominator and archaeological footnote. Every one of us carries the molecular fingerprints of that long winter of scarcity. Studies of mitochondrial DNA show the same oddly shallow family tree, a genetic shrug that whispers, yes, your extended family reunion could theoretically fit inside a village tavern if you brought a few folding chairs. Our reduced genetic diversity explains why unrelated people can share startling amounts of code, why rare diseases sometimes run rampant, and why anthropologists keep using words like founder effect, as if humanity were the world's longest-running startup. That legacy isn't doom, it's identity, traits honed in adversity, cooperation, storytelling, foresight, didn't evaporate once herds returned, and rainfall normalized. They became the scaffolding for language, ritual, and let's build a city instead of constantly running from cats the size of Volkswagens. Today's empathy, problem-solving, and obsessive need to form group chats are evolutionary receipts for a past where sharing food literally kept the species alive. But history isn't satisfied with being background trivia, it insists on relevance. The planet is again shifting under our feet, albeit by means of fossil fuels and industrial fervor, rather than saber-tooth ambushes. Climate change, mass extinction, and dwindling biodiversity echo the old tune of conditions worsening faster than you can adapt. Back then, sheer luck and small numbers gave us a re-roll. Now billions of us are tangled in global supply chains, powered by an energy diet our Paleolithic cousins couldn't pronounce. The stakes are higher, the safety net thinner. Here's the inconvenient truth. A reduced genetic palette means we're hardy but not invincible. A truly novel pathogen or ecosystem collapse could test us harder than any Pleistocene drought. Add our fondness for polluting air, warming oceans, and nibbling at rainforests like they're tapas, and we've built a buffet for chaos. Yet the same cognitive wiring forged in that bottleneck, anticipation, collaboration, innovation, remains our ace card, provided we actually use it. Parallels between then and now are eerie. Small groups once had to read landscapes like scripture. We must read carbon curves with similar reverence. Cooperation once meant sharing a mammoth flank. Today it means transnational treaties, resilient agriculture, and perhaps not burning quite so many hydrocarbons. Where they passed stories around the fire, we passed data across fiber optics, but the moral's identical: adapt or vanish. And let's not ignore culture's role. Back then, myth and memory taught survival ethics. Don't drink from that swamp became folklore. Modern equivalents are climate models, IPCC reports, and occasionally doom-scrolling Twitter. The challenge is translating spreadsheets into instinct before catastrophe clarifies the lesson. Evolution built us for foresight. Denial is a learned habit we should promptly unlearn. The humor writes itself. Imagine a Paleolithic elder grumbling, "Kids these days, they don't respect the antelope." Fast forward. Climate scientists sigh. "Governments these days, they don't respect the carbon budget." Both complaints orbit the same plea. Notice the warning signs before the meteor, the drought, or the emissions graph skyrockets. Yet there's optimism hiding in the fossils. If a ragged handful of hominins could restart the species without antibiotics, air conditioning, or global communication, what might 8 billion toolmakers accomplish with satellites, renewable energy, and decades of hard-earned ecological science? Our ancestors survived by being stubborn, adaptive, and endlessly inventive. We're their heirs. Those reflexes are still on tap, waiting for us to stop doom-scrolling long enough to deploy them. So yes, The Pleistocene bottleneck matters. It's proof humanity's chapter can continue even after a terrifying plot twist, but also a cautionary whisper: don't tempt fate by ignoring the environmental ledger. Extinction isn't theatrical, it's silent, swift and final. Our best homage to the survivors who trudged across that thin genetic wire is to make sure their effort wasn't a one-season wonder. We've inherited a planet far richer than any our ancestors glimpsed. We've inherited, too, the responsibility to keep it habitable. Our DNA remembers scarcity. Our reason foresees consequence. Together, they urge a simple, unglamorous truth. Sustainability is survival by another name. Because once was drama enough, let's skip the encore. Picture this. You crack open the shutters of your modest timber-framed home, inhale deeply and immediately regret being born with a nose. That, in short, is an average morning in a bustling medieval town. Forget birdsong and dew-kissed meadows. What greets you is an airborne potluck of chamber pot residue, livestock leavings, unwashed humanity, and whatever died in the alley last night. The good news? You have a house. The bad news? So does your pig, and it's renting the corner nearest your bed. Medieval towns were not designed with freshness in mind. Streets were narrow, more alley than avenue, and paved with a charming mixture of mud, straw, and whatever dripped from yesterday's dinner. Houses leaned toward each other like gossiping neighbors, their upper stories nearly touching, funneling every scent directly into the lungs of unsuspecting pedestrians. If architecture is a silent language, medieval towns were constantly shouting, "Brace yourself." Why did it smell so spectacularly bad? First, the absence of modern sewage. Pipes were rare, drainage laughable, and chamber pots were emptied wherever gravity allowed. Waste collection meant open a window and hope the wind is in your favor. Add in livestock, because a family without a goat was a family without milk, and you've got cows, chickens, and pigs living practically indoors. Every creature produced contributions. Those contributions lingered. Second, personal hygiene was different. Without indoor plumbing, baths were an event, not a routine. People bathed occasionally, not religiously. Clothes were aired out more than washed. Combine that with wool garments, wood smoke, and a diet heavy on onions, and your personal aura could fell a canary. Yet nobody flinched. When everyone smells, no one does. It was a great equalizer of nostrils. Behind the stench lay a serious misunderstanding. They believed bad air miasma caused illness. Germs? Too tiny to imagine. But vapors? Absolutely sinister. Medieval medical texts describe corrupted airs as the root of plagues. To them, smell wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. This belief shaped everything from city planning or lack thereof to the popularity of aromatic herbs stuffed into pouches. If you thought the reek could kill you, you'd carry a sprig of lavender like your life depended on it. Sensory overload wasn't limited to city centers. Markets were olfactory war zones, butcher stalls dripping blood into gutters, fish vendors hawking wares that had seen better tides, bakers accidentally scorching yesterday's bread into charcoal. Horses and oxen did what horses and oxen do, right there on the cobblestones. And somewhere, inevitably, someone was tanning hides, a process involving ammonia-rich urine. Imagine Sunday brunch aromas, except everything is gone off and there's no brunch. Inside homes it wasn't much better. Hearth smoke clung to rafters like a guest who overstayed their welcome. Damp straw bedding provided a thriving ecosystem for fleas. Cooking smells refused to leave, layering like the geological strata of every meal since Michaelmas. Domestic animals wandered freely. A chicken might hop on the table mid-meal to see if breadcrumbs were better this century. Privacy was minimal, ventilation worse, and deodorant not even a rumor. Yet people adapted. Humans are impressively nose-resilient. Grow up around pungency, and your brain labels it normal. That fishy meat manure melange, Tuesday. It's why travelers often complained louder than locals. Foreign merchants wrote wide-eyed descriptions of intolerable stenches, while townsfolk wondered what the fuss was. Civilization is just a matter of what you're willing to ignore. Add superstition to the mix, and the smell takes on cosmic significance. Foul air wasn't merely unpleasant, it was morally suspect. Priests might warn of corruption of the soul mirrored by corruption of the air. When plagues arrived, people pointed fingers at the stench rising from sin. Civic leaders held processions, burned incense, and prayed harder, all while the cesspit 3 doors down burbled happily. Daily life required selective perception. Merchants pitched wares over wafting odors, lovers courted by candlelight while competing with goat musk, and children played merrily in streets best left uninvestigated. The medieval nose filed an endless list of grievances, but there was no HR department to complain to. If you wanted to live, you got used to it, or kept a sprig of rosemary under your nose and hoped for mercy. So yes, medieval towns were vibrant centers of trade, art and culture, but olfactorily, they were the equivalent of being trapped in a locker room with 1,000 unwashed gym socks and no exit. Step outside and your nose immediately files a complaint with management. Unfortunately, management is a rooster and a bucket of slops. In short, the Middle Ages smelled like history in the making and compost. If you plan to time travel there, pack a sturdy stomach and an even sturdier sense of humor. After all, surviving the medieval stink is the first achievement toward truly understanding how our ancestors lived and sniffed through centuries. If you ever stroll through a lovingly reconstructed medieval town today, you'll notice cobblestones, flower boxes, and maybe a nice bakery selling almond tarts. Don't be fooled. Real medieval streets were less storybook postcard and more choose-your-own-stench adventure. They were the digestive tract of the town. Things went in, fewer things went out, and what stayed behind created a smell best described as feral soup. Start with the drainage, or rather, the enthusiastic absence of it. Many streets boasted an open sewer, a shallow channel carved into the middle of the lane to collect every imaginable liquid. It wasn't some quaint brook murmuring through town. It was a slow-motion parade of dishwater, stale beer, vegetable scraps, and whatever your neighbor's cow contributed at dawn. The current meandered lazily, daring the summer sun to turn it into a bouquet of regret. Walking to market meant either hopping over this miniature moat or pretending it wasn't there, a skill the locals perfected with monk-like denial. Waste disposal followed the town motto, "If it's gross, put it somewhere we're not standing right now." Butchers hacked carcasses in stalls and casually tipped blood and entrails straight onto the street. Fishmongers did the same with heads and scales which glistened briefly before joining the community stew underfoot. Tanners dumped rinse water spiked with lime and animal fats, creating puddles that doubled as experiments in how long human dignity can hold its breath. Dogs and cats roamed freely, snacking on discarded bones, ensuring yesterday's mess was smeared evenly from corner to corner. Every alley doubled as a trash can. Every trash can was imaginary. Old shoes, broken pots, rotten turnips, and the occasional unidentifiable blob lay where they fell. Rats considered it an all-inclusive buffet. Flies RSVP'd permanently. If something didn't stink when discarded, it volunteered within hours. The town didn't so much clean as develop new layers. Archaeologists today love this because each stratum tells a story. Residents back then hated it because each stratum told their noses a tragedy. Enter the heroes of hopelessness, the rakers, or scavengers. Officially tasked with clearing refuse, they wielded wide shovels, stout wheelbarrows, and iron stomachs. Their pay? Minimal. Their prestige? Lower than a goat's self-esteem, but someone had to prevent the thoroughfare from vanishing under a landslide of cabbage leaves and cow pies. Town records occasionally mention night carts, lumbering wagons trundling after dusk to haul filth beyond the walls. The journey was often timed to avoid crowds and potential riots from anyone forced to inhale that mobile apocalypse. For the raker, career prospects were unlimited. Dignity was not. Imagine rising before dawn, facing a mile of clogged gutters, and realizing the day's highlight is that the goose feathers are at least dry. Yet their work mattered. Without them, main roads risked becoming impassable. Even so, thorough cleansing was rare. A festival, royal visit, or rumor of plague might inspire civic pride and a hurried scrape of the muck. But everyday tidiness languished in a ditch somewhere, probably next to a deceased rat. Urban design didn't help. Narrow streets formed funnels of filth, while overhanging upper stories turned the lower lane into a shaded corridor where smells lingered like unwanted relatives. Rain was both a blessing and a curse, occasionally flushing waste downhill, more often smearing it into a democratic sludge for everyone to share. Winter merely froze the problem solid, preserving it lovingly for the first thaw. Markets were olfactory war zones. Picture live poultry tethered beside butchers dismembering pigs, while spice vendors desperately hawked cinnamon in a losing battle for nasal dominance. Slop underfoot mixed with stray feathers and spilled ale, until the street resembled a stew pot no tavern would admit to owning. Yet commerce thrived. Shoppers tiptoed between puddles, hiked hems and bargained over onions as though ankle-deep compost was merely ambience. Legal attempts at control occasionally surfaced. Bet town charters might ban dumping offal, polite medieval word for everything nobody wants in front of doorways, but enforcement was laughable. Fine one butcher, watch 3 more empty their tubs at dawn. Civic authorities sometimes ordered street sweeping before major holy days, a symbolic cleansing as much as practical. But lasting reform needed consistent infrastructure, and infrastructure cost money, something municipalities preferred to spend on fortifications and feasts. Animals amplified the chaos. Horses clattered through town, leaving steaming testimonials to their digestive vigor. Pigs foraged freely, churning refuse into something even less identifiable. Geese flapped indignantly at carts, while stray dogs recycled scraps with alarming efficiency. The medieval street was a living ecosystem, teeming with creatures who viewed your shoe not as sacred ground but as a potential serving dish. Surprisingly, residents grew desensitized. To the uninitiated traveler, the stench was a villainous wall. To locals, it was wallpaper. They navigated filth like fish in water, stepping neatly around hazards while discussing the price of barley. Survival required a blend of selective memory and sturdy boots. So when you picture a medieval city street, don't imagine pristine cobblestones and a lute player singing ballads. Envision a gauntlet of gutter broth, ankle-deep mystery, and rakers shoveling like mythic Sisyphus without the literary fame. The street wasn't paved with gold, it was paved with don't ask. And yet commerce flourished, people fell in love, and life marched on, carefully, lest it slip on something unspeakable. If medieval streets were an olfactory assault, the indoors wasn't exactly a lavender-scented sanctuary. Enter humanity's oldest coping mechanism. Cover the smell with something that almost smells better. When life gives you the smell of dead fish, douse it in rosemary and pretend you're fancy. Among the better off, fragrance was an art form bordering on desperation. Wealthy households stocked bundles of herbs as if their survival depended on it, which, according to miasma theory, it did. Juniper wood, rosemary and bay were burned in the hearth, not merely for ambience but as a tactical strike against whatever had died in the lane outside. The resulting haze clung to tapestries, softened harsh aromas, and announced to visitors, "We have coin, and our air pretends to be civilized." Incense wasn't limited to holy days. Merchants imported frankincense, myrrh, and ambergris, pricey luxuries for noses tired of last week's cabbage. A lady of means might scatter crushed lavender across the rushes on her floor, so that each footstep released a hint of summer rather than a hint of goat. Juniper berries, when tossed into the fire, produced a resinous perfume that convinced residents they had bested the reek at least until the wind shifted. For those on the move, personal fragrance tech took shape in the pomander, a hollow metal sphere, filigreed like a miniature treasure chest, stuffed with aromatic ingredients. Imagine a medieval essential oil diffuser you wore on a chain. Inside could be cloves, cinnamon, or dried rose petals. Anything vaguely pleasant and, more importantly, capable of bullying your senses into temporary happiness. Gentlefolk dangled pomanders from belts or necklaces, wafting self-defense clouds wherever they roamed. If a pomander felt too precious, there was the simpler option, the nosegay, tiny bouquets, roses if you were stylish, marjoram or tansy if you were practical, were clasped in gloved hands, discreetly raised whenever the breeze betrayed the gutter's contents. Courtiers swished into gatherings trailing these miniature gardens, half social accessory, half olfactory lifeboat. Some manuals of etiquette even advised which herbs symbolized virtue, turning a simple sprig of thyme into a fashion statement and a moral billboard. Household ingenuity went further. Tapestries were lightly perfumed, wardrobes tucked with sachets of crushed herbs, and bed linens spritzed, crudely by rubbing them with rosemary water. Scented candles, when available, flickered bravely against both darkness and despair. The act of fragrancing became almost ritualistic, an early morning sprinkling of rosewater across the table, a fumigation of storerooms with juniper smoke, a quick wave of the pomander before greeting guests. Religious spaces perfected the art. Churches swung censers of incense, a practice layered with theological meaning but possessing an undeniably practical bonus, drowning out the collective aroma of hundreds of parishioners who hadn't met soap since Candlemas. Frankincense smoke curled through naves, sanctifying the air and muting the aroma of sheep pens lurking beyond the churchyard. High feast days smelled like heaven because the alternative was unprintable. Miasma theory amplified this obsession. People truly believed bad air was a weapon of disease. Therefore, anything sweet-smelling acted as both charm and shield. Physicians recommended fumigating homes with aromatic woods, and midwives waved sprigs of mint around sickbeds as if banishing evil itself. Perfume wasn't vanity. It was survival strategy. To them, scent could ward off plague as surely as prayer. Markets capitalized on the craze. Apothecaries sold sachets of dried flowers, vials of rosewater, and tiny cakes of musk at prices reflecting both rarity and public desperation. Recipes for sweet waters circulated, distill petals, steep in wine, splash liberally, and hope no one notices the goat tethered by the door. Nobility competed for ever more exotic scents, ambergris scraped from whales, civet secretions from wildcats, items that smelled better than a dead rat, only by comparison, but carried social cachet. Travelers armed themselves with smell shields. A wealthy merchant might carry a velvet-wrapped ball of spices, while a physician on house calls shoved vinegar-soaked cloth into his beak-shaped mask, a habit that would reach bizarre artistry during later plagues. These personal microclimates offered psychological comfort even when their protective power was dubious at best. Yet beneath the aromatic theatre, genuine aesthetic delight bloomed. Medieval herb gardens weren't just pharmacies. They were perfumeries in miniature. Monasteries cultivated lavender, sage, and sweet woodruff, partly for medicinal use, partly for the sheer relief of walking through greenery that didn't threaten your gag reflex. Herbal manuscripts read like poetry. Rose doth comfort the heart, marjoram bringeth mirth. Even the sternest abbess welcomed the waft of mint after a day spent among humanity's more pungent blessings. Social signaling hovered in every whiff. A perfumed gown hinted at wealth and refinement, while the unadorned smell of sheep marked you as common. Guests noticed, gossip followed. One noblewoman's ledger notes, one pot of violets for the hall, lest the steward faint from humours. Fragrance, then, was as much status symbol as hygiene substitute. Of course, not all attempts succeeded. Some brews of musk and civet created an aroma less floral meadow, and more ferret with ambition, but in a world perpetually flirting with decay, even an over-enthusiastic civet note felt like progress. Better to smell eccentric than authentic. So the next time you encounter a spritz of overpriced cologne, spare a thought for ancestors clutching pomanders as if clutching hope itself. They weren't merely masking a nuisance, they were declaring defiance against an environment that never stopped fermenting. Perfume, herbs, and a sliver of optimism turned unbearable into survivable. Medieval noses may have been surrounded by calamity, but at least with a whiff of rosemary, they could pretend to be fancy. If modern self-care is scented candles and a daily shower, medieval self-care was surviving until Tuesday. The bath wasn't so much a habit as an event, half cleansing, half existential gamble. A bath a year keeps the neighbors near or far, depending on timing, was less a joke and more a municipal fact. Public bathhouses did exist, but think of them less as spa retreats and more as medieval multiplexes of steam, gossip, and questionable plumbing. In larger towns, bathhouses often sat near rivers, fed by water scooped, sluiced, or persuaded through wooden conduits. The better establishments offered heated rooms, a rudimentary changing area, and tubs wide enough to float at least some of your dignity. Prices ranged from a modest coin to a king's ransom, depending on amenities like lukewarm water or towels that aren't damp from yesterday. Bath frequency varied wildly by region and century. A merchant in 14th century Paris might bathe once a week in cool weather, while a farmer in rural Flanders might shrug at the concept until harvest ended. Nobility sometimes indulged more frequently, if only because servants could haul barrels of water without complaining louder than a mule. Yet even the richest lord hesitated to turn every evening into a bubble bath, mostly because bubbles hadn't been invented and the water was likely hosting an ecosystem. Soap, when available, was a weapon rather than a comfort. Early lye-based formulas scoured skin with the enthusiasm of a blacksmith's file. Gentle exfoliation? Forget it. Medieval soap left you squeaky in both the literal and ominous sense. Herbal additives softened the blow slightly, but luxury brand often meant less likely to remove your fingerprints. Unsurprisingly, many people skipped soap altogether, preferring a brisk splash and a prayer. Then there was the water itself. Rivers and wells rarely earned awards for purity, especially downstream of tanneries, dye works, or yesterday's festival waste. Heat killed some nasties, but heating took time, firewood, and the patience of saints. Cold baths were quicker, but spurred legends about catching fevers of the chill. Folklore whispered that bathing too soon after eating, or too often during certain moons, invited ailments. Superstition and inconvenience joined hands and politely escorted hygiene out the door. Medical theory added another obstacle. Many healers swore by the idea that pores were gateways. A warm bath opened them, leaving the body dangerously exposed to evil vapors. Better, some argued, to let a protective crust of sweat seal you against miasma. Yes, you read that correctly. Dirt as armor. When the Black Death ravaged Europe, fear of inviting the plague through pores made people barricade themselves in filth like olfactory survivalists. For those who bathed, the experience was social. Bathhouses doubled as taverns, meeting halls, and matchmaking hubs. Imagine today's health club, but with more ale and fewer treadmills. Patrons lounged in shared tubs, swapped gossip, and occasionally conducted business deals waist-deep in tepid water. Gender separation varied. Some places scheduled ladies' nights, others shrugged and embraced the chaos. Regulations waxed and waned as moralists fretted about temptation simmering alongside the steam. At home, bathing was an ordeal. Heating enough water to fill even a small wooden tub required armloads of firewood and nerves of steel. Servants or family members lugged bucket after bucket from the well, timing the operation so the first pail didn't chill before the 10th arrived. By the time the bath was ready, the bather was either exhausted or reconsidering life choices. Children went first, elders last, and the water's clarity deteriorated faster than a bard's reputation at closing time. Despite the obstacles, some nobles elevated bathing to spectacle. Records described tubs scented with rose petals, warmed stones to maintain heat, and embroidered sheets awaiting freshly scrubbed skin. Kings and queens occasionally turned bath time into diplomacy, inviting allies to share scented pools as a sign of trust or poor ventilation. Chronicles praise monarchs who maintained pleasant odor, proof that even amid power struggles, nobody wanted a ruler who could fell a council chamber by breathing. Regional quirks added spice. Scandinavian cultures, with their love of sweat lodges and icy plunges, considered bathing invigorating, while some Mediterranean towns blended Roman tradition with medieval caution, alternating between indulgence and abstinence. In colder northern realms, the winter bath sometimes meant scraping with cloths soaked in warmed beer or vinegar, both cheaper than firewood and arguably tastier. Bathing's reputation oscillated with the times. In periods of plague, bathhouses shuttered amid rumors they spread contagion faster than rumor itself. Religious reformers periodically denounced public baths as dens of sin, more brothel than hygiene. The humble peasant, watching the moral ping-pong, often concluded that skipping the tub was safer for soul and body alike. Yet people yearned for freshness. Herbal rinses, dry rubs with linen, and scented powders mimicked cleanliness. Physicians prescribed steam inhalations for balancing humors, while grandmothers swore by vinegar rubs to banish stagnant airs. It wasn't our version of clean, but intent matters. So does surviving February without frostbite. Bathing, then, was an uneasy alliance of aspiration and risk. Some took the plunge, others embraced protective grime, and many oscillated depending on rumor and weather. To step into a tub was to gamble with health, purse, and dignity. But when it worked, when the water steamed and the herbs wafted, even the most skeptical medieval soul might sigh. So this is what angels smell like. If medieval life was a perpetual assault on the nostrils, survival demanded strategy. You couldn't stop the world from fermenting, but you could at least fight back with whatever foliage you could stuff into your sleeve. Think of it as medieval Febreze, except it's a sack of lavender you keep shoving in your own face. The simplest defense was the humble kerchief, a square of linen, lightly spritzed with rosewater or crammed with crushed mint, became both fashion statement and nasal barricade. Aristocrats embroidered theirs with family crests. Peasants relied on scraps of homespun, but the ritual was the same: fold, sniff, survive. Some households kept jars of vinegar steeped with rosemary or wormwood. A quick dab transformed cloth into a portable detox chamber. Walk through a fish market, inhale vigorously, and you could almost believe you were in a meadow if meadows also shouted prices for eels. Festivals introduced floral wreaths, not just for beauty but for olfactory sanity. Garlands of meadowsweet, marjoram and sage crowned revelers, masking the mingled scents of sweat, roasted oxen and questionable ale. Even coronations bore whiffs of strategy. Chroniclers mention royal banquets decked in strewn herbs, less to impress guests than to convince noses not to mutiny. An opulent wedding smelled of roses by design, because the alternative bouquet was barnyard in July. Travelers swore by vinegar-soaked sponges sealed in little boxes or silver holders. A quick sniff offered both bracing tang and moral support. Physicians insisted the sour vapor strengthened the spirits against corrupt airs, and if nothing else, vinegar was cheaper than an exorcism. Some gourmands even claimed a vinegar sponge sharpened appetite, though critics suspected it merely drowned the ambient stench long enough to eat without weeping. Medical texts brimmed with recipes for sweet airs, aromatic blends heated gently over coals. Juniper, thyme and storax resins smoldered in braziers to clarify the humors. A patient confined to a sick room might be surrounded by steaming bowls of wine spiked with herbs, the vapor inhaled as both cure and courage. Houses plagued by illness were fumigated until the rafters glistened with resinous haze. Neighbors might mock, but the family believed themselves sealed inside a fragrant fortress. Plague doctors elevated olfactory defense into high drama. Their iconic beaked masks, now Halloween fodder, were essentially wearable spice cabinets. Inside the snout, cloves, cinnamon, juniper berries, sometimes camphor or dried rose petals. The logic was simple. If death rides the breeze, filter the breeze through a salad. Gloves, waxed coats and wide-brimmed hats completed the ensemble. But the nose was the star. An avian silhouette striding through terror, sniffing its own mobile apothecary. Much of this was placebo by another name, yet it mattered. When streets reeked of decay and rumor, pressing lavender to your lips wasn't just hygiene theater, it was sanity maintenance. Aromatic rituals reassured families that they were doing something, while fate rolled dice behind the scenes. Even the poorest soul could pluck mint from a hedgerow, tuck it behind an ear and whisper, "At least my right nostril believes in tomorrow." Customs evolved around these props. Etiquette manuals suggested discreetly raising the pomander or kerchief. rather than dramatic gagging. Courtiers developed subtle sniff gestures, hiding revulsion behind politeness. A particularly refined noble might offer a sprig of thyme to a guest, implying "join me in pretending this room doesn't smell like destiny's compost heap." In courtly circles, exchanging scented favors flirted with romance. "Your rosemary pouch shields me from despair, how gallant." Kitchen herbs moonlighted as nasal saviors. Cooks strung bundles of sage or bay above hearths, doubling flavor with fragrance. Dinner guests leaned in, inhaling broth laced with dill, convinced the stew's aroma armored them against the slop stream outside. Even alehouses tossed mint into casks, partly for taste, partly to disguise the bouquet of last Thursday. Countryside households harnessed smoke itself. Villagers hung drying herbs in rafters. As hearth fires curled upward, the scent mingled into rustic incense. Shepherds carried sprigs of pennyroyal or mugwort while driving flocks, claiming it heartened the head. Children wove daisies into caps, both playful and practical. An accidental prototype of the floral crown thinks it was invented. Behind these antics lay quiet resilience. Smell was constant, but despair needn't be. Guard. A sprig of marjoram on the table said, "We acknowledge the chaos, but supper will be lovely." Even the vinegar sponge, pungent, sharp, absurd, was proof of agency. If you couldn't cleanse the world, you could at least curate your nose's playlist. So yes, medieval smell survival often looked like amateur botany on parade, but it kept spirits afloat. The bouquet was half real, half make-believe, and wholly necessary. Faced with a relentless sensory siege, people stitched together defenses of leaf, spice, and faith. In their hands, a perfumed kerchief wasn't vanity. It was courage folded into linen, ready to meet the next breeze. Lawmakers of the medieval world were forever composing bold proclamations about restoring civic dignity, which is a poetic way of saying, "Please, for the love of Saint whoever, stop dumping goat guts in the marketplace." They issued ordinances as fast as quills could scratch parchment. No refuse in alleys, no carcasses on bridges, fines for tossing chamber pots midday. On paper, the city was on the verge of fragrant utopia. In practice, the streets continued their lifelong career as nature's landfill, smirking at the ink that tried to tame them. Lawmakers swore they'd clean up the city. The city swore back silently with its stench. Towns flirted with civility by mandating where privies should stand, often over rivers, so that the tide could do what janitors would not. The Thames, the Seine, and countless nameless streams groaned under this arrangement, transforming from lifeblood of the city into liquid biography of everyone's bowels. When officials ordered householders to build cesspits rather than let filth trickle freely, many complied grudgingly, some not at all, and a few discovered new loopholes. A pit built suspiciously close to a neighbor's boundary, mysteriously leaking downhill by coincidence. The legal phrasing under penalty of fine sounded formidable, but the average constable had neither the nose nor the patience to pursue every guilty bucket. Enter the night soil men, a job title that even career counselors delivered with an apologetic shrug. Under the cover of darkness, these hardy souls crept through courtyards, lowering long-handled scoops into cesspits and hauling up what no one dared describe. Wagons rumbled toward fields beyond the city walls, where the cargo gained a dignified new identity as fertilizer. The work paid modestly, smelled extravagantly, and occupied a social tier somewhere between indispensable and invisible. When the moon was bright, residents could trace the raker's route by the chorus of windows slamming shut. Civic pride occasionally staged a comeback in the form of muck rakers, municipal employees charged with shoveling the worst accumulations from major thoroughfares. Armed with rakes, brooms, and a stoic disregard for dignity, they dragged heaps of dung and refuse toward waiting carts. Market days demanded overtime. For every hoofprint seemed to sprout a new aromatic challenge. Children sometimes followed, giggling at the spectacle, tossing pebbles or daring each other to breathe deeply. The rakers kept their gaze low and their humor drier than the piles they battled. Some cities experimented with communal dumps, designated lay stalls where citizens could unload garbage legally. The theory: concentrate filth in one place rather than let it enjoy free range. The reality: residents grumbled about hauling muck uphill. Many opted for shortcuts, and the lay stall overflowed like an underfunded experiment. Still, the effort marked the first shy steps toward organized waste management, the ancestor of our municipal trash trucks, minus the hydraulics, plus more shouting. Occasional outbreaks of disease inspired flurries of regulation. Sudden spikes in mortality prompted councils to declare cleansing weeks, mandating that every household scrape and sweep its frontage. Streets briefly gleamed under the sun like reformed sinners, but within days carts rolled again, pigs resumed their open-air banquets, and the cycle reasserted itself. Chroniclers note with weary humour that the plague fled less often than the council imagined, suggesting that penmanship was a poor disinfectant. Behind the laws lay genuine anxiety. City fathers feared trade would wither if visiting merchants gagged their way back to Flanders. Moralists fretted that stench reflected sin, that a foul street foreshadowed a foul soul. Priests preached cleanliness of heart while sidestepping puddles of dubious origin. Artisans lobbied for stricter enforcement, not from love of purity, but because filth ruined dyes, spoiled hides, and attracted rats that competed with stored grain. Every guild meeting seemed to end with the same sigh: somebody should fix this. Every now and then a charismatic mayor promised transformation. No dung shall remain within our walls. Trumpets blared. A token number of carts clattered forth, and for a single shining week the square smelled almost civil. Then budget fatigue, citizen laziness, and the gravitational pull of human habit undid it all. Regulations lingered, faded, and resurfaced in rewritten form a decade later, proof that parchment forgives faster than the nostrils forget. What saved towns from outright collapse was not the brilliance of law, but the stubborn resilience of people willing to coexist with their environment's creative chemistry. Merchants still hawked cloth, bakers still kneaded dough, children still played tag around steaming gutters, laughter mixing with odors in an uneasy civic truce. For all the ordinances, the rakers and the midnight wagons, medieval sanitation remained an unfinished symphony, humming in the key of compromise. If one stood at the city gate at dawn, watching the first cart of night soil rumble past, it was hard not to marvel at the choreography: law chasing filth, filth outrunning law, and humanity somewhere between gagging and grinning. Progress existed, just slow enough to smell every step. By the time the Middle Ages drew to a close, the odoriferous symphony of towns had done more than assault nostrils. It had quietly shaped the future of public health. Every pomander, every herbal sachet, every raker's shovelful of refuse was a small, awkward step toward the modern understanding that clean streets, fresh water, and controlled waste matter. The medieval nose may have suffered daily, but it was also training the senses of future generations. If you can survive a week in a Paris market, a poorly ventilated subway car seems luxurious by comparison. Communities learned lessons, albeit slowly. Ordinances that failed in enforcement still planted seeds of civic responsibility. Night soil collection and centralized lay stalls hinted at organized waste management. Incense and herb fumigation demonstrated an intuitive grasp of air quality, even if the science was miasma rather than microbiology. The notion that certain smells indicated danger, spoiled food, stagnant water, or decaying waste persisted and eventually evolved into epidemiological awareness. Medieval noses, battered though they were early sentinels of public health, sniffing out problems that would take centuries to solve systematically. Consider the tolerance required just to navigate daily life. A modern human conditioned by antiseptic wipes and climate-controlled offices would falter at the sight of a single overflowing trash bin. Twitter would melt down. News anchors would gasp. Meanwhile, medieval merchants, children, and rakers negotiated their environment with astonishing pragmatism, smelling disaster and carrying on regardless. They didn't have luxury deodorants, air fresheners, or sanitation inspectors. They had determination, ingenuity, and the occasional nose plug of rosemary or vinegar. The difference between then and now is not just scent intensity, but expectation. The medieval human measured survival by the ability to ignore the unbearable rather than obsess over it. Ironically, the very extremity of medieval smells highlighted the value of modern conveniences. Public sewer systems, municipal trash collection, and basic hygiene became revolutionary precisely because people remembered, or legend remembered, what life had smelled like without them. The medieval stink wasn't just a historical quirk, it was a benchmark. It set the stage for centuries of reform, innovation, and occasional overreaction. A plague here, a cholera outbreak there, and gradually, the recognition that odorless doesn't just smell nice, it correlates with safety. Yet the medieval approach also fostered creativity in the face of adversity. Pomanders, nosegays, vinegar sponges, and herbal fires were both practical and performative. They allowed people to assert control over an environment that otherwise controlled them. Some historians might dismiss these efforts as quaint superstition, but imagine your nose negotiating daily with streets, livestock, and neighbors without these small interventions. Ingenuity, perseverance, and humor combined to make life not just bearable, but survivable. The Middle Ages may have reeked, but they also taught people to improvise, adapt, and endure they did. Children grew up with smells so potent that a modern perfume aisle seems timid. Adults functioned with resilience that today's hyper-clean offices could scarcely imagine. Entire cities operated as living ecosystems of humans, animals, waste, and herbs, each contributing to a grand experiment in olfactory endurance. Survival depended as much on clever noses as clever minds. When towns eventually added more structured sanitation, the groundwork laid by these early coping strategies smoothed the way. So, as we reflect on the medieval stink, there's something both horrifying and inspiring. Horrifying, because stepping outside might have felt like diving into a vat of centuries-old compost. Inspiring, because those same noses navigated it with grace, fashion, and sometimes gallows humor. Pomanders swinging, rosemary tucked under noses, vinegar sponges held bravely aloft. They built, in the process, the rudimentary blueprint of urban hygiene. The takeaway is simple. Modern noses may flinch at a single garbage heap, but our ancestors faced a daily sensory siege that would make even the bravest Instagram influencer retreat in horror. Yet they thrived. They invented floral masks, kerchief rituals, and municipal scavenger systems that, however primitive, paved the way for our understanding of health, cleanliness, and air quality. If you survived the smell, congratulations, you've unlocked the medieval achievement, iron nose. You may not have needed to carry a pomander or brave a raker's wagon, but in spirit you've walked the alleyways of history with resilience, humor, and an appreciation for the subtle fact that modern plumbing is nothing short of miraculous. The medieval stink was more than an inconvenience. It was a teacher, a challenge, and if you paid attention, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of relentless aromatic adversity. Next time you catch a whiff of garbage on your commute, remember your ancestors endured far worse, and somehow they smiled and maybe even waved a sprig of rosemary at it. Imagine a world where every sunrise could signal disaster. Medieval and early modern Europe was a place of uncertainty so thick you could almost taste it in the morning air. Crops failed with the unpredictable temper of weather. Plagues wiped out entire villages before anyone could cry witch, and storms tore through timbered homes as if the heavens themselves were auditioning for a demolition crew. Life was a precarious balancing act, and when things went wrong, humans had a centuries-old instinct. Someone must be responsible. Often, that someone wore a pointy hat, brewed strange potions, or simply lived too close to the marketplace. The good news, your crops grew. The bad news, that one old lady's cooking might be plotting your demise. Villagers didn't need scientific reasoning to interpret misfortune. If the barn burned down, it wasn't an electrical fault, because electricity didn't exist. If livestock died mysteriously, it wasn't disease. It was Mrs. Hilda and her suspiciously pointy hat. obviously consorting with powers beyond mortal comprehension. Every bad harvest, every sudden illness, and every freak accident became evidence of a hidden, malevolent hand, and the collective imagination ran wild with suspicion. Fear was as much a survival tool as a social glue. Superstition served as a framework for understanding the chaos of daily life. When you couldn't explain why a river flooded, why locusts swarmed, or why your neighbor's goat started talking back in some metaphorical way, labeling the incident as witchcraft or sorcery provided a semblance of control. The world was unpredictable, yes, but at least it had a face, albeit one with a crooked nose and a penchant for stirring suspicious brews. Villages became incubators of anxiety. Streets were narrow, homes tightly packed, and rumors traveled faster than the plague itself. A single cough, a dropped loaf of bread, or a garden overrun by weeds could be twisted into evidence that some hidden hand, often a woman living on the outskirts, was manipulating fate. People whispered in doorways, pointing fingers behind fluttering curtains. Every unexplained ailment became a story, every storm a potential moral lesson, and every neighbor a suspect in a sprawling involuntary drama. It wasn't just practical misfortune that stoked fear. Nature itself seemed complicit. Lightning struck with dramatic flair, a sudden frost ruined wheat, and rivers overflowed with stubborn persistence. Villagers interpreted these events not as natural phenomena, but as messages or punishments from forces beyond their understanding. When a particularly violent thunderstorm demolished the barn, the villagers unanimously decided that Mother Nature had nothing to do with it. The true culprit, they agreed, was Mrs. Hilda's pointy hat. In their minds, magic and calamity were inseparable partners in a dance of doom. Superstition also provided entertainment, in a darkly humorous way. Around the hearth, storytellers regaled children with tales of witches casting spells on neighbors' chickens, or enchanting the wind to scatter laundry in mid-air. While these stories reinforced communal norms, beware the outsider, respect the mysterious, they also brought a tiny spark of joy in a world where survival was the main game. A laugh at a ridiculous tale of bewitched turnips could coexist with genuine fear that the same enchantment might befall your family. Humor and horror were inextricably intertwined. Social tensions further fueled witch hysteria. Villages were tightly knit, but also rife with envy, grudges, and petty rivalries. A woman who successfully healed the sick with herbs could be hailed one week and accused of poisoning the milk the next. If the wind favored her during a storm, some would claim she conjured it. If she was seen talking to animals, murmurs of witchcraft spread faster than any gossip about the mayor's new boots. Every interaction became loaded with suspicion. Even mundane acts, collecting firewood, brewing ale, tending a garden, could be interpreted as occult preparation. This was a society in which reason coexisted uneasily with imagination. People tried to make sense of catastrophe using the tools at hand: folklore, superstition, and social consensus. It wasn't irrationality in the modern sense. It was adaptive thinking for a world that offered scant guarantees. By attributing calamity to witches, villagers created narratives they could manage, they could discuss, argue, and crucially attempt to respond. By seeking protection, performing counter-rituals, or in later chapters, participating in trials. Ultimately, the fear of witches reflected the precariousness of life itself. Europe's early modern population lived amid constant uncertainty, and superstition was the lens through which the inexplicable became comprehensible. Lightning was Mrs. Hilda's work, yes, but it was also a story, a moral, and a communal experience. Every accusation, every whispered suspicion, and every frantic gesture toward a suspected witch was part of a broader attempt to understand, survive, and even occasionally laugh at the chaos of existence. In this first chapter of our story, the stage is set, a world teetering between terror and humor, logic and legend, survival and superstition. The good news: life goes on. The bad news: you might have to keep an eye on Mrs. Hilda and her pointy hat just in case. Long before the first witch trial hit the courthouse, Europe was alive with magic of a kind that didn't necessarily involve malice or murder. In the forests, meadows, and villages, people celebrated the cycles of the seasons, honored spirits of the land, and relied on wise women for remedies, guidance, and the occasional dramatic storytelling session. Pagan rituals were often colorful, communal, and practical, dancing in a circle to ensure a good harvest, leaving offerings at sacred springs, or gathering herbs for remedies. It was festive, grounded in the rhythm of nature, and occasionally included more alcohol than one might call strictly medicinal. In short, it looked like a lively party where everyone had a role, and the local flora served as both decoration and prop. Turns out, everyone dancing in the forest with herbs wasn't just having fun. They were basically history's first party planners, accused of dark magic. To a modern eye, these rituals appear charming, even wholesome, but to the Christian authorities of the time they were suspect. The church was in the process of consolidating moral and spiritual authority, and practices outside its control were increasingly viewed as dangerous. Paganism didn't vanish overnight. Instead, it was reframed as devilish, deceptive, and morally corrupt. What had once been a festival of fertility or a seasonal rite became evidence that humans were colluding with infernal powers. The transition wasn't subtle. A woman who knew which herbs soothed fevers or warded off insects could quickly find herself labeled a witch rather than a healer. Her skill in identifying edible mushrooms became suspicious knowledge, and her uncanny ability to calm quarrels in the village square was recast as manipulation. A cheerful May Day dance in the woods, complete with flowers and singing, could be interpreted by some overzealous cleric as a ritual invoking demons. The vibrant, joyous, and pragmatic aspects of pagan life were stripped down into something sinister when viewed through the lens of fear and control. Church authorities relied on folklore to bolster their warnings. Stories of spirits, mischievous fairies, or talking animals were reinterpreted as evidence that the devil was active in everyday life. A dry stream could be blamed on malevolent magic rather than seasonal drought. A sudden death in the village might be attributed to curses rather than disease. In this way, religious doctrine and local myth merged, creating a powerful narrative in which ordinary people, especially those on society's margins, could be suspected of nefarious activity. It was an early form of mass communication. The story of sin, danger, and punishment traveled faster than any courier could ride. Colorful pagan symbols, once understood as markers of the natural world, became coded signs of evil. Herbs, amulets, ritual dances, and moonlit ceremonies were interpreted as evidence of satanic allegiance. Even animals became suspect. Cats, particularly black ones, were cast as familiar spirits aiding witches. Ravens, owls, and toads all carried the weight of suspicion. Suddenly, what had been neutral or helpful in a practical sense became dangerous under the reinterpretation imposed by religious authorities. A wise woman carrying a basket of healing herbs could be seen as preparing potions for mischief rather than remedies, and any advice she gave was viewed with trepidation rather than gratitude. The consequences of this shift were profound. Social cohesion, previously strengthened by shared rituals and seasonal celebrations, began to fracture. Accusations spread through villages like wildfire, often based on envy, personal conflict, or misinterpretation. A woman living alone, a healer with extensive knowledge, or simply someone who didn't conform perfectly to the church's moral code could quickly become a target. The merging of folklore and religious doctrine created a climate in which fear of the unknown replaced communal trust. Villagers learned to watch each other, to interpret ordinary behavior as potentially dangerous, and to hedge against unseen threats. Humor, however, never completely disappeared. Imagine a village dance in spring, people twirling with garlands in their hair, chanting and laughing. Today we might see a joyful seasonal celebration. Back then, an officious monk might scribble in his ledger, observed pagan gathering, likely negotiating with devils, must pray thrice and warn the Lord. That combination of misinterpretation and moral panic, fearful authorities viewing harmless revelry as existential threat, is a recurring theme that shaped early witchcraft accusations. Ultimately, the Church's reinterpretation of pagan practices laid the groundwork for a cultural lens in which everyday events could be seen as proof of supernatural evil. Fertility rituals became satanic plots, herbal medicine became witchcraft, and seasonal dances became conspiracies. Misunderstandings multiplied, rumors spread, and the line between imagination and evidence blurred. Communities, once bound together by celebration and shared belief in the natural world, became arenas for suspicion, vigilance, and the early stirrings of fear-fueled justice. By framing ordinary pagan practices as dangerous, the stage was set for the societal obsession with witches, pacts with the devil, and trials that would dominate Europe for centuries. What had begun as celebration and ritual was now tangled with moral authority, religious oversight, and social paranoia. In these forests, fields, and village squares, the seeds of witch hysteria were planted, nurtured by misunderstanding, fear, and the occasional overdramatic priest. By the late Middle Ages, suspicion alone wasn't enough to condemn someone as a witch. No, fear required a theological punch, something that gave paranoia teeth and, crucially, a legal backbone. Enter Satan. The devil didn't need PR. Humans were already doing the heavy advertising. Lightning struck, clearly a devilish message. Livestock died unexpectedly, satanic meddling. A neighbor's butter churn didn't work properly, definitely infernal interference. The devil became the ultimate scapegoat, giving every unexplained misfortune a convenient face with horns. The church was quick to capitalize on this cosmic drama. By codifying witchcraft as heresy, it transformed superstition into a juridical tool. Suddenly, accusations of magic weren't just idle gossip, they were crimes against God. A whispered rumor could escalate into an official charge, a trial, and potentially a death sentence. Ordinary behaviors, collecting herbs, tending to sick neighbors, speaking to animals, or even being notably clever, could now be framed as evidence of devilish collusion. Where once a healer's knowledge was celebrated, it was now suspect. Where once a midwife's skill was admired, it was considered dangerous. Every ordinary act had the potential to be twisted into evidence of a pact with the Prince of Darkness. The devil wasn't just a distant theological concept, he was a participatory character in daily life. Treatises warned that witches could fly at night, summon storms, or cause infertility with a glance. The ordinary world became infused with potential malevolence. A woman making a healing potion for a neighbor could be accused of crafting a poison to destroy her entire family line. A man grinding flour in the mill might be suspected of embedding hexes in the grain. The church's rhetoric expanded fear exponentially. If your neighbors weren't plotting against you, the devil surely was. Legal texts, sermons, and inquisitorial manuals codified these ideas into rules that were terrifyingly precise. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487, became a canonical guide for identifying witches, describing signs, methods, and legal procedures. According to its guidance, witches were assumed guilty by nature, their confessions coerced or imagined, their behaviors misinterpreted. A twitching eyelid, a slight limp, or an unusual glance could be construed as evidence of collusion with demons. Ordinary eccentricities, superstition, and gossip all fused into a single narrative. You were either with God, or you were negotiating terms with hell itself. The social consequences were immense. Fear of the devil's agents created vigilance or paranoia on a village scale. Neighbors scrutinized each other's habits. Children learned early to point out suspicious behavior, and those on society's margins, widows, healers, the elderly, or simply the outspoken, were most at risk. Commonplace actions such as brewing beer, harvesting herbs, or keeping certain animals could be interpreted as ritual preparation for devilish plots. In short, normal life became a minefield. Step wrong, and you could find yourself on the receiving end of theological scrutiny so intense it made a modern audit look like a friendly chat. Theologically, Satan served as both explanation and motivator. Catastrophes that could not be explained by weather, disease, or chance were attributed to his agency, and moral panic followed naturally. Villagers weren't just afraid of witches, they feared the devil himself. Every odd occurrence reinforced the narrative. An illness, a flood, a bad crop, or a misfired musket ball could all be traced back to infernal influence. Humans eagerly did the heavy advertising, amplifying the panic. A suspicious glance here, a whispered warning there, a midnight rumor about a neighbor's nocturnal activities. The devil, it seems, had little to do except watch humanity promote his brand relentlessly. This theological framework also justified increasingly extreme measures. Torture, forced confessions, and executions were rationalized as divine necessity, protecting the community from infernal corruption. Witch hunts were no longer localized moral disputes. They were sanctioned campaigns against a perceived global conspiracy of evil. Ordinary people were drawn into a world where simple misunderstanding could become evidence of cosmic treachery. A child's mischievous prank, a stranger's odd clothing, a healer's successful herbal remedy, all could now be reframed as sinister acts with metaphysical consequences. Humor, of course, is still possible when viewed at a safe distance. Imagine a town meeting in which villagers are earnestly debating whether Mrs. Barkley's cat is her familiar or just an ordinary tabby. A flustered witness swears the cat spoke during a thunderstorm. The priest nods gravely. Yes, he intones. This is unmistakable proof of a diabolical plot. In a modern context, the idea is absurd, but for a medieval community, it was deadly serious. In the end, the devil's influence and the human tendency to see conspiracy at every corner set the stage for centuries of persecution. Ordinary behavior, misunderstood intentions, and eccentric practices were recast as proof of infernal allegiance. Theology did not merely justify fear, it magnified it, codified it, and legitimized human suspicion in ways that had tangible, sometimes fatal consequences. The result, a society in which the devil wasn't just an abstract villain, but a character with a daily presence in the lives of the fearful. A sneeze, a spilled basket, a successful remedy, any of these could be spun into evidence of satanic influence. The devil didn't need to work hard. Humans had already written the script, performed the drama, and ensured that no one could escape the suspicion of divine and infernal judgment alike. Once accusations were made, the next step in the medieval and early modern witchcraft saga was the courtroom, or more accurately, the hall of terrifying theatrics masquerading as legal procedure. Trials were meant to determine guilt, yet the system was rigged from the start. Accusations were often based on rumor, envy, or misunderstanding, and the accused were presumed guilty. The medieval mind loved symmetry. Someone must be to blame, and someone must confess. What better way to ensure confession than by combining social pressure, fear, and a few imaginative devices designed to make even the bravest soul reconsider their life choices? The judicial process began with interrogation. A neighbor might swear that Mrs. Hilda had caused the sudden death of a goat or the wilting of roses. That was enough for officials to demand an explanation. Defense was practically impossible. Witnesses were usually villagers who disliked you, or feared that your alleged mischief might spread. The courts relied on evidence so flimsy it could barely hold a feather, yet somehow it was deemed more trustworthy than testimony from the accused. The moral of the story? If someone dislikes your soup, you might be next. Torture was a frequent tool. Confess to turning your neighbor's cow into a frog, or else a good night's sleep in the rack. The rack, thumbscrews, strappado, and various devices that made modern gym equipment seem delightfully optional, were all deployed with creative zeal. Pain, of course, produced confessions, though rarely of factual truth. People confessed to flying, summoning demons, or attending Sabbaths they had never heard of, simply to stop the agony. In other words, the court obtained precisely what it wanted: admissions of guilt, regardless of reality. Logic was optional, theatrics were mandatory. Proof was equally absurd. Witch hunters relied on tests designed to identify the supernatural. One famous method involved binding the accused and throwing them into water. Float, obviously a witch, defying natural laws to escape divine punishment. Sink, not a witch, though now at risk of drowning. Another common test involved witch marks. Any unusual mole, scar, or blemish was interpreted as a sign of devilish favor. It didn't matter that everyone had freckles or birthmarks, any irregularity could suddenly be evidence of consorting with Satan. Modern medicine might scoff, but medieval logic treated these tests as incontrovertible science. Accusations could also be rooted in personal grievances, a neighbor's jealousy, a rivalry over land, or a quarrel at the marketplace, could all translate into charges of witchcraft. The accused were encouraged to name accomplices, often leading to a domino effect of arrests. A single finger pointed could spark a small-scale panic that engulfed entire villages. And yet, through all of this, officials insisted they were merely administering justice. One could almost hear them muttering, order, discipline, and righteous horror, all in one tidy package. The courtroom itself was an arena of psychological theater. Judges and inquisitors often approached trials with solemnity and a flair for dramatic irony. Witnesses described impossible feats, the accused flying through the night sky, cursing crops from afar, or conversing with animals. The accused, meanwhile, faced the impossible task of defending themselves against forces beyond comprehension and human endurance. Humor and tragedy existed side by side. A child's goat, a family's missing chicken, and a neighbor's spilled ale became evidence of supernatural conspiracy. The social consequences were as severe as the legal ones. Accused witches were isolated, shunned, and often tortured to extract confessions that satisfied both officials and fearful villagers. Even if eventually acquitted, or increasingly rarely, exonerated, they rarely returned to their previous lives unscarred. Families, reputations, and entire communities were reshaped by suspicion and fear. This was justice reimagined as spectacle, morality intertwined with terror, and governance fused with superstition. And yet, the process had its unintended comic moments when viewed from a modern lens. Imagine a frail woman on trial, swearing she never cursed the local blacksmith, while witnesses insist they saw her perform a ritual to make his hammer miss its mark. Judges nod gravely, scribes record every detail, and the courtroom collectively imagines the impossible, magic in motion. In hindsight, the absurdity is evident, but at the time it was terrifyingly real. The artistry of accusation, torture, and trial reflected a society trying to impose order on chaos. Ordinary behaviors were reframed as sinister, simple acts of care or eccentricity became evidence of malevolent intent, and public spectacle reinforced moral authority. Fear was methodical, socially sanctioned, and legally codified, producing confessions that satisfied the community's hunger for explanation and closure, whether true or not. By the end of the day, trials were as much about performance as judgment. Judges, villagers, and officials participated in a theater of terror, where the scripts were dictated by fear, folklore, and religious orthodoxy. The accused, meanwhile, were caught between reality and imagination, truth and coercion. In this dark, ironic stage, the lines between justice and spectacle blurred entirely, setting the tone for centuries of witch hunting to come. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the fear of witches had spread across Europe with an almost viral intensity. Yet the experience of witch hunts varied wildly depending on where you lived. Germany, for example, became infamous for its relentless persecution. Villages in the Holy Roman Empire saw mass trials in which dozens, sometimes hundreds of people were accused at once. The Trier witch trials of the late 1500s saw over 300 confessions extracted from the unfortunate, often under the creative application of torture. Villagers were terrified, officials were zealous, and the devil's supposed influence seemed to have a robust local franchise. In this environment, being slightly odd or simply unlucky was enough to land you in the court docket. Scotland, on the other hand, had a distinctly moralistic flavour to its hunts. The Scottish witch craze focused heavily on the accusation that witches sought to undermine social and religious order, often targeting women accused of seducing men, controlling weather, or meddling in politics with satanic intentions. One striking feature of Scottish trials was the rigorous application of the law in some areas. Confessions had to be verified, evidence scrutinized, yet absurdity still reigned. If a woman's broomstick was seen leaning oddly in the corner, It could theoretically serve as evidence of flight training. Europe had more witches than Starbucks had coffee. Every village seemed to have one. France's approach was sometimes less frenzied and more bureaucratic, though not necessarily safer. Trials in the French countryside combined local folklore, superstition, and inquisitorial zeal. Accusations often reflected social tensions, a land dispute, a familial feud, or jealousy over a flourishing garden could transform into evidence that someone had called down the devil's wrath. France also experienced the peculiar phenomenon of localized witch panic, where an entire town might collectively accuse dozens of neighbors, sometimes culminating in executions that felt almost like civic purges rather than legal proceedings. Across the Atlantic, Salem in the Americas offered a distinctly puritanical twist on witch hysteria. The Salem witch trials of 1692–1693 were smaller in scale, but culturally potent. The Puritan settlers' intense religious worldview, combined with a tight-knit, stress-ridden community, created a pressure cooker for accusations. Unlike in Europe, the focus often leaned more heavily on moral deviance. Failure to conform to strict social or religious norms could lead to charges of witchcraft. Yet absurdity thrived here as well. Spectral evidence testimony that the accused appeared in a vision to afflict the victim was accepted in court. In other words, if your ghost attacked someone while you were asleep in bed, that counted as evidence. Legal systems contributed heavily to the variation. German courts, often relying on inquisitorial procedures, encouraged confessions under torture. Scottish courts combined local custom with statutes that gave considerable leeway to judges. French courts leaned on bureaucracy, using meticulous records to justify actions that may have seemed perfectly logical in their era. In Salem, courts struggled with conflicting notions of evidence and morality, often privileging fear and rumor over reason. These structural differences shaped not only the intensity of the hunts but also who was most vulnerable. Widows, healers, outspoken women, and socially isolated individuals were consistently the primary targets, though in some areas even men were swept up in hysteria. Folklore and local superstition further flavored each region. German villagers often interpreted everyday mishaps, blighted crops, sick cows, sudden storms, as the result of malevolent witches. In Scotland, the emphasis was on moral corruption and satanic seduction. French fears intertwined with folklore about fairies, spirits, and local demons. In Salem, spectral visitations and unexplainable maladies sparked panic. Despite these differences, the underlying psychology was remarkably consistent. Fear, uncertainty, and social tension combined to make ordinary people vulnerable to extraordinary accusations. Humor, of course, still sneaks in when we look at the patterns from afar. Imagine a German village meeting, a dozen villagers insisting that the baker's cat must be complicit in ruining the rye harvest, or a Puritan household in Salem, nervously watching the maid sneeze twice in succession, immediately whispering to the minister that the devil had made an appearance. From a modern perspective, the hysteria seems both absurd and darkly comic, but in context, these fears were profoundly real and devastating. Despite geographic differences, witch hunts shared common themes: scapegoating, fear of deviation from social norms, and the use of legal or quasi-legal structures to enforce morality. They reflect how communities respond when uncertainty, misfortune, and religious fervor collide. Ordinary people trying to make sense of a precarious world often fell victim to a system that rewarded suspicion, punished difference, and amplified paranoia into full-scale communal panic. Across Germany, Scotland, France, and Salem, the consequences were similar: families destroyed, individuals executed or imprisoned, and communities scarred. The geographical variation shows that while the devil may have been blamed everywhere, each society dressed him up in slightly different clothing, added local flair, and made sure he got plenty of stage time. In the end, the spread of witch hunts demonstrates a universal human tendency. When life is unpredictable, fear can metastasize into something terrifyingly organized. And humor and absurdity, though present, cannot always save the day. Witch hunts weren't random. They followed patterns that reveal a surprisingly consistent logic, even if that logic was terrifyingly warped. Behind the spectacles of accusation, interrogation, and execution lay a social psychology that fueled fear like a wildfire through dry grass. Communities under stress, plagued by famine, disease, war, or unexplained misfortune, needed explanations. Humans are remarkably adept at assigning blame when uncertainty strikes. Enter the scapegoat, someone convenient, visible, and often a little socially awkward. If your neighbor suddenly sneezed 3 times during a thunderstorm, congratulations, you were probably next on trial. Scapegoating was only part of the machinery. Villages were small, everyone knew everyone else, and social networks were tightly woven yet fraught with tension. Envy, personal grudges, and rivalries could all be transformed into accusations of witchcraft. Did Mrs. Hilda's garden flourish while yours withered? Suspicion. Did the miller's son suddenly outshine everyone in the village race? Sorcery, obviously. Humans, it seems, have always been excellent at mixing personal frustration with supernatural imagination. The line between natural misfortune and deliberate malevolence was remarkably thin, and medieval minds had no problem seeing witches behind every mishap. Moral panic played a crucial role as well. Once suspicion was voiced, it gained momentum. Fear is contagious. When one villager begins to whisper, "I think Agnes is cursing the cows," others often respond with corroborating evidence, sometimes real, sometimes imagined. Collective anxiety amplifies itself, creating a feedback loop in which everyone is both witness and potential victim. Panic spreads faster than fact-checking, and before long, the village is a theater of terror in which every unexplained cough or sudden gust of wind becomes a sinister sign. Modern psychology gives us some clues about how this worked. Humans are wired to detect patterns, even when none exist, and to prioritize potential threats over neutral information. In a medieval context where life was already precarious, these instincts became magnified. Misfortune, illness, or unexpected deaths were attributed to human agency rather than chance. Witches provided a convenient focal point for anxiety, giving communities a target for their collective fear. Assigning blame in this way may seem irrational now, but in the context of the time, it offered a measure of understanding and perversely a sense of control. Rumor and gossip acted as accelerants. One accusation could spark dozens more, creating a chain reaction of suspicion. A disagreement at the market, an accidental injury, or even someone's slightly odd behavior could be interpreted as evidence of dark intentions. The hysteria created social pressure to conform. If you failed to accuse your neighbor or to express appropriate fear, you yourself might be suspected. Communities became self-policing, turning everyday interactions into tests of loyalty, vigilance, and moral rectitude. Envy and social tension were often disguised as moral outrage. A widow living alone might be accused because she had resources that others lacked. A healer's knowledge of herbs could provoke fear because it made her influential and independent. Even children were implicated. A child's pranks or misbehavior could be reframed as signs of diabolical manipulation. In effect, fear turned ordinary social dynamics into a theater of suspicion, where the stakes were life and death. The absurdity of the process is striking from a modern perspective. Imagine a group of villagers huddled around a fire, earnestly discussing whether a missing loaf of bread is the work of a witch or just poor planning. Every sneeze, every storm, and every minor misfortune feeds the narrative. Yet in that moment, participants believed they were protecting themselves and their community from cosmic harm. Humor and horror intertwined. The collective imagination could invent witches, demons, and plots with astonishing speed, all while maintaining the appearance of solemn seriousness. Comparisons to modern mass hysteria are surprisingly apt. While today we don't hang neighbors for minor misfortune, social media amplifies fear, rumor, and outrage at a global scale. Panic spreads faster, evidence is often anecdotal, and the pressure to conform or respond can feel overwhelming. Medieval witch hunts were local and slow, yet the psychological mechanics, fear, scapegoating, moral panic, are eerily familiar. Human brains haven't changed much. The medium has. Ultimately, the science of fear explains why witch hunts were so persistent and pervasive. Stressful environments, combined with social tension, personal grudges, and cognitive bias toward detecting threats, created perfect conditions for hysteria. Communities, desperate for explanations, assigned blame, enforced conformity, and celebrated confessions that confirmed their fears. Every sneeze, storm, or flourishing garden could be interpreted as proof of wrongdoing. Humans, it seems, have always excelled at turning anxiety into narrative, suspicion into law, and imagination into collective action. In this chapter, we see that witch hunts were not merely religious phenomena. They were psychological and social events, driven by the human mind's desire for order, explanation, and security in a chaotic world. Fear became contagious, rumors became evidence, and ordinary behaviors became extraordinary crimes. If you think your neighbor sneezing in the rain is trivial, medieval Europeans would have had you questioning whether your own boots were cursed. The mechanics of mass hysteria ensured that the devil, or at least the idea of him, was everywhere, and no one was entirely safe from suspicion. After centuries of fear, accusations, and theatrical trials, the tide of witch hysteria finally began to recede. Europe, and later the American colonies, slowly started embracing a world in which explanations for misfortune didn't automatically include a sinister old woman, a talking cat, or a clandestine midnight Sabbath. The decline of witch trials was not sudden. Old beliefs are stubborn, but rational thought, emerging science, and legal reforms gradually chipped away at the foundations of fear. The first cracks appeared when skeptics started asking inconvenient questions. If witches were so powerful, why didn't they fly faster than the wind? Why didn't they choose their victims more selectively? Why did confessions extracted under duress seem suspiciously convenient? Physicians, philosophers, and early scientists began to examine claims with a critical eye. Natural phenomena were increasingly understood in terms of cause and effect rather than diabolical intervention. Diseases were traced to contagion, storms to weather patterns, and crop failures to soil and climate, not necessarily the handiwork of someone's neighbor. Legal reform played an equally critical role. Courts became more cautious, demanding concrete evidence rather than mere rumor or coerced confession. Torture, once a routine tool for extracting admissions of guilt, became less acceptable in some regions. In places like England, judges increasingly required verifiable proof, which of course was almost impossible to produce for alleged magical acts. Gradually, the presumption of guilt that had fueled the terror of previous centuries began to give way to the presumption of innocence. A court that no longer relied on spectral evidence or mystical intuition was a radical departure from the practices that had allowed panic to flourish. The exoneration of some accused witches marked an important shift in societal thinking. Women who had spent years shunned, imprisoned, or at risk of execution were sometimes cleared, and families could at least partially reclaim honor and dignity. While many injustices could never be undone, the legal system's growing insistence on reason over rumor symbolized a broader cultural transformation. Communities were forced to confront the consequences of prior hysteria and to reconsider how fear had been weaponized against ordinary people. Of course, humor finds a way, even in reflection. In the end, people realized the only thing magical about Mrs. Hilda was her talent for avoiding stares and town gossip. She wasn't summoning demons or flying on a broomstick. She was simply surviving in a society obsessed with suspicion. The absurdity of past fears becomes clearer in hindsight, a reminder that human imagination can be both wonderfully creative and disastrously credulous. Communities once gripped by terror gradually learned that everyday quirks, social disagreements, and minor misfortunes are not inherently proof of supernatural conspiracy. Yet superstition didn't vanish entirely. Folk beliefs persisted alongside emerging rational thought, particularly in rural areas where cultural change moved slowly. People continued to carry charms, leave offerings for good fortune, or consult local healers, but the difference was now a matter of personal choice rather than legal coercion. Reason began to prevail, but not without leaving traces of the old fears in stories, proverbs, and cultural memory. The era of mass panic and ritualized accusation faded, but human credulity remained a cautionary companion. This transition from superstition to skepticism reflects a broader evolution in European society. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on observation, logic, and critical inquiry, helped cement the notion that natural laws, not supernatural malice, govern the world. Scientific thinking provided tools to explain previously inexplicable events, while legal reforms ensured that fear alone could no longer dictate life and death outcomes. Communities gradually learned that the imagination, while powerful, should not be allowed to dictate justice. Reflecting on the arc of the witch trials, one sees both tragedy and comic irony. Centuries of fear, torture, and social paranoia were fueled by imagination, rumor, and moral panic. But human resilience and reason eventually prevailed. Lessons emerged: be skeptical, question extraordinary claims, and remember that coincidences are usually just coincidences. And perhaps most importantly, never underestimate the ability of ordinary humans to turn social tension and superstition into elaborate theatrical drama. The legacy of this period is layered. On the one hand, witch trials are a cautionary tale about the dangers of fear, groupthink, and unchecked authority. On the other hand, they are a reminder of human creativity, humor, and the sometimes absurd ways in which communities navigate uncertainty. As we close the chapter on the age of witch hysteria, it is comforting to know that the only magic still at play in everyday life is the mundane sort. Someone avoiding gossip, a well-timed sneeze, or a neighbor's uncanny knack for keeping their garden alive. Humans, it seems, have always needed stories, some cautionary, some comedic, and some just plain strange to make sense of the world around them. In the end, the transition from superstition to skepticism didn't erase fear entirely, but it taught communities that reason, evidence, and critical thinking are far more reliable than rumor, hysteria, or spectral accusations. And for those who survived the terror and absurdity of previous centuries, a measure of wit and a keen sense of irony became essential survival skills. Mrs. Hilda, broomstick-free and gossip-shy, stands as a symbol of endurance, human curiosity, and the slowly triumphing power of common sense over collective panic.